Jon Snow had not meant to hear everything. He had been pacing in the library of Winterfell on a chill, moonless night, glancing through dusty tomes about House Stark's history as he often did when sleep eluded him. But that night, beyond a heavy oak door slightly ajar, he heard Samwell Tarly's gentle voice drifting into the corridor. Sam spoke to Bran Stark in that calmly urgent way of his, as though knowledge demanded to be shared even at the gravest cost. Jon heard only fragments at first, whispers about Rhaegar Targaryen, about Lyanna Stark, about the child who was not a bastard. Then Bran's voice. Steely, certain, unyielding as the roots of the weirwood trees. Jon heard his name. He froze. He should have turned away then, should have let them speak in private. But suspicion and dread had grown inside him in the past weeks. He stepped closer. An unseen wrung of his heart told him to push through that door, or at least stand still long enough to catch the truth. For so long he had yearned to know who he was. The idle talk of Eddard Stark's rumored indiscretions had followed Jon his entire life, an invisible brand in the shape of a question mark. The truth, if it was near, had too strong a pull. When he heard Samwell say, "His name's not Snow, or even Sand, he is Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne," Jon could not breathe. His body felt as though it were being drawn into a hidden current. He did not realize he had opened the door until Samwell and Bran's startled faces came into view. For an instant, none of them spoke. Sam stammered an apology. Bran's pale eyes did not leave Jon's face. "You were meant to know," Bran said at last, voice unwavering. "If you heard us, then perhaps the time has come." Jon shut the door behind him with careful slowness, as though a single jolt might shatter the precarious moment. He remembered how Bran had changed since returning from beyond the wall, how he carried himself with the eerie composure of one who had seen the tapestry of time unravel. Bran was older and younger all at once, and Jon's heart constricted at the sight. Perhaps this was his brother, and perhaps not entirely. Jon swallowed. "Sam? Bran? Tell me plainly. If what you said is true, then everything I know is a lie." His voice caught on the final word. Sam nodded. "It's not a lie, but a secret. One that Lord Eddard Stark carried to his grave." Sam's hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the polished table. "We found proof. Bran saw it. I found it in the Citadel's records. The Rhaegar Targaryen who annulled his marriage to Elia Martell, who then wed Lyanna Stark in secret. Their child was me," Jon said, in something that was barely a whisper. "It can't be." Bran looked at him with a softness that did not match the cold of his eyes. "Father protected you because Robert Baratheon would have killed you if he knew. You were raised a bastard to keep you safe. You might not want it, Jon, but you are Aegon Targaryen." The memory of that night returned to him now, weeks later. He was standing in that same library, alone and sifting through the avalanche of consequences. But it had not stopped with the knowledge. No, Jon Snow or Aegon Targaryen had known of this for days, then weeks, and the secret weighed on him like iron shackles. He kept it silent for as long as he dared. For as long as he believed that revealing it would do more harm than good. For as long as he wanted to remain. Simply Jon Snow, the man who had pledged to fight the White Walkers and protect the living. But all secrets, like hungry wolves, scratched at the door of revelation, and at last Jon recognized he could no longer hold it in. Something in him could not abide living a lie while forging alliances, while asking the North to sacrifice their blood for him. The North needed truth. The North deserved to know who led them, especially if that leader might be more Targaryen than Stark. Too many had already died for lies in these wars. If trust was the only shield the living had left, then that trust must be underpinned by honesty, or so Jon believed. He remembered the War Council meeting in the Great Hall of Winterfell, torches sputtering gold in the gloom. Around the battered table stood Sansa and Arya, Davos and Brienne, Tormund and the few lords who remained loyal to House Stark. Their eyes flicked to Daenerys Targaryen, who listened gravely. A hush fell. Jon inhaled deeply, feeling as though he stood on the precipice of a cliff. Still he spoke. "The White Walkers march south. We've seen them. Winterfell must stand as the bulwark of the living, or all is lost. The Night King can be stopped. We have a plan. Daenerys Targaryen has brought her dragons, and we have dragonglass from Dragonstone. We have allies in the Vale, some in the Riverlands. But there is one more thing I must tell you. He cast a glance at Daenerys, who looked perplexed. On the other side of the table, Sansa's eyes narrowed. Arya's face was unreadable, but Bran, from his seat in the corner, seemed calmly expectant. The lords of the north began to shift uneasily. Jon felt his throat constrict. You know me as Jon Snow, your king in the north. You know me as Ned Stark's bastard, a man who swore his life to the Night's Watch and who has returned to lead you against the dead. He let the words hang in the still air. But I have learned that I'm not Ned Stark's son. My mother was Lyanna Stark, and my father was Rhaegar Targaryen. The shock was immediate. Daenerys's eyes widened, something like fear or amazement flickering there. Davos's jaw worked, but no words emerged. A hush overcame all. Sansa stood rigid and silent. Arya's hand fell to the hilt of a dagger at her belt, but whether for comfort or something else, Jon could not tell. Then the murmurs swelled in the great hall, an ominous tide of confusion and anger. One of the lords, Lord Glover, a man with a stern brow and narrow eyes, choked out, "Targaryen?" as though spitting a curse. "And we've bent the knee to a Targaryen bastard?" "No," Jon said, and his voice was firm, though each syllable cost him. "I'd be the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, if this claim is as true as we believe." Daenerys pressed her lips together. The swirl in the hall grew louder. There were shouts of betrayal. Others demanded quiet, demanded proof. He heard Davos speak above the din. "Quiet! Let the king, let Jon explain." But it was too late. The room roiled like a storm-tossed sea. Jon's stomach churned. He wished he could say the right words, hold them in place with calm logic. But the implications crashed over them all as brutal as any wave. At last, Sansa, voice cold but authoritative, raised her hands. "Enough," she said. Silence returned, though tension hung in the air like the black stench of a battlefield. Sansa looked to Bran, who inclined his head slightly. Jon swallowed. "We have proof from the Citadel's records. Bran's visions confirm it. My father, the man I called father, swore to my mother to keep her son safe. She died giving birth to me at the Tower of Joy, soon after her secret marriage to Rhaegar Targaryen. Ned Stark saved me from Robert Baratheon's wrath. It was the only way to keep me alive." Every face in the room twisted with shock. Some turned pale, others red with fury. The Northern Lords had fought Dragonfire once before in living memory, had lost dear ones in the last Targaryen wars. They revered Ned Stark, but hearing that he had shielded a Targaryen stirred resentment and confusion. At the far end of the table, Daenerys Targaryen remained rigid, her soft mouth pressed into a thin line. She had spent a lifetime believing she was the last Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne. Now the rightful claim to that throne stood before her in the shape of the man who had knelt to her. Her voice was brittle. "So you are my nephew," she managed to say, "and rightful heir." The words sounded forced, strangled by a swirl of anger and something Jon could not interpret. He could not meet her gaze. Bran's voice, quiet and distant, rose in the hush. "It's true." No one dared dispute Bran's knowledge. Sansa's face was unreadable. Arya alone seemed defiant, as though the name Targaryen was less important than the brother she knew. Jon's heart hammered. "I tell you this because I owe you truth," he said, looking between them all face to face. "I have not changed. I am Jon. I was raised a Stark. The threat beyond the wall doesn't care about the name Targaryen or Stark. We stand together or we perish. That is all." He might as well have flung a torch into the tinder. The hall erupted in uneasy shouting. It took the rest of the night for the uproar to subside, and by then the damage was done. Some of the more stalwart lords seemed to remain at Jon's side, confounded but loyal. Others cast distrustful glares, as though discovering a viper in their midst. Tormund Giantsbane, for his part, let out a hearty laugh and said, You're still the same crow to me, and I still like you better than half these fancy pricks." That broke the tension momentarily, but the smiles that followed were fleeting. Jon saw Sansa retreat into herself, wearing that regal expression that gave nothing away. Arya was stone-faced. Daenerys kept her distance, speaking only to Missandei in low, hurried tones. Davos tried to calm the lords, telling them that no matter what, Jon had proven his devotion to the North. But the seeds of discord had been planted, and Jon felt them take root in every suspicious glare, every whispered conversation. He had not slept that night, turning the consequences over in his mind. Yet it was done. The next day broke with a frigid wind slicing through Winterfell's courtyards. Jon felt the biting chill as he walked along the battlements, cloak buffeted behind him. He looked down at the yard. 100 men practiced with pikes under Grey Worm's watchful eye, the Unsullied's discipline a stark contrast to the rugged Northmen who had begun to mingle in the adjacent yard. Farther along, the Dothraki, restless and uneasy in the snowy climate, paced and shouted at one another in a language as harsh as the winter wind. And in corners, he spotted hush-voiced gatherings of northern lords, some of them pointing up to where Jon stood. They no doubt saw silver hair when they looked at him, whether it was truly there or not. He heard a soft footfall on the stairs, then Sansa appeared at his side, her red hair twisted into an elegant braid. She wore a cloak of gray fur that whispered about her figure. "You should have told me first," she said, her voice crisp. Jon gazed at her. "I know, perhaps I should have, but it wouldn't have changed. It would have changed how it was delivered," Sansa said pointedly. "The North, the lords we rely on, the bannermen who respect the Stark name, some of them feel deceived." "I didn't mean to deceive them. I didn't know, Sansa." Her eyes searched his. "You knew for weeks, though, didn't you?" He looked away. "Yes, I needed to confirm it. It sounded impossible even when Bran and Sam told me. And then the letter from the Citadel arrived, confirming the records. I spent days deciding how to tell you." He paused, his voice tight. "Maybe I should have done it differently, but it is done now. We cannot fight a war with secrets gnawing at us. Father always said that lies tear families apart." She sighed, a frozen cloud leaving her lips. "I'm not angry that you told them, Jon. I'm angry that you might have just started another war or at least a rift when we can't afford one. The Northerners have no love for Targaryens. We only just got them to bend the knee to you, a man they believed was Ned Stark's son. Now, some might stand with you still, but many will waver." "I'm not calling myself a Targaryen king," Jon said, hating how defensive his voice sounded. "I told them the truth because they deserve to know. If they choose to fight for me, it's because we share the same purpose, not because I claim the Iron Throne. That throne belongs to Daenerys. I have no wish for it." Sansa lifted an eyebrow. "Daenerys might not see it that way, nor might her advisors. You stand in her way legally." He pressed his lips together. "I won't press a claim. Is that not enough?" Sansa sighed again. "Perhaps it will be. But Daenerys Targaryen has fought half her life to reclaim that throne. She's lost people dear to her. You think she'll just accept that she's not the rightful heir by law and happily let you disclaim it? Even if you disclaim it to her, your men might still clamor for you to take it. The lords of Westeros might start whispering among themselves. Better a man raised in the North than a foreign queen, and you might be forced to decide. None of that helps us defeat the Night King." In that moment, Jon realized how sharply Sansa understood the Game of Thrones, while he did not. He felt a weary gratitude that she was at his side, though she was clearly angry with him. He took her hand. "No matter what happens, you are my sister. We stand together. I promise you, I have no ambition beyond stopping the dead and saving as many lives as we can." Sansa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then we had better manage this carefully. There's no going back." He wished he could rest, but the day's burdens were far from over. By midday, a cold sun struggled through the clouds as Jon found himself in a smaller hall, sitting with Davos, Sansa, and a handful of the more loyal northern lords. Mormont, Serwyn, and a few others. Lady Lyanna Mormont, young and fierce, perched on the edge of her seat, arms folded. Despite her youth, her glare could subdue men 3 times her age. "I don't care if his father was a Targaryen or a White Walker," she said when Davos asked for her counsel. "I remember who stood with us when no one else did. I remember who risked his life to bring us dragonglass and alliances. Jon Snow saved the North. I say he's still our king." From the other side of the table, Lord Serwyn inclined his head. But the North remembers what House Targaryen did in the past. We remember the thousands who burned under Dragonflame. Doesn't mean Jon Snow would do the same. But some of our older lords, they'll recoil from this." Lady Mormont set her mouth in a hard line. "Then they are fools. Have they not seen what Jon Snow can do? Have they not seen that he protects the North above all?" Davos cleared his throat. "We all know what the real enemy is, my lady. Those ice devils marching from beyond the wall. Best not to let old grudges get in the way of survival. But we can't pretend there won't be friction. Best to address it openly." Sansa shifted in her seat. "If the North is divided, we could lose everything. We must keep them focused on the threat, not on who might sit the Iron Throne once all is done." Jon looked around the table. "Do you still stand with me?" he asked quietly. He had to know beyond their words. They looked at him one by one. Lord Serwyn gave a grudging nod. Lady Mormont spoke for them all. "The North chose you for our king. We won't abandon you, but you must show the others that you remain a Stark at heart. They won't listen to words alone. They'll want to see it." He nodded. Relief seeped through him, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only a fraction of the Northern leadership. Others might desert or, worse, conspire. But for now, he had at least these loyalists. He whispered silent thanks and prayed it would be enough. By dusk, the gates of Winterfell clanged open to admit more riders from the Vale. The Knights of the Vale had come at Sansa's urging, riding under the banner of the Falcon. Baelish was gone, but the arrangement he had set in motion lingered, ironically serving Sansa and Jon rather than the spider at the center of the web. Jon went out to the courtyard with Davos to greet the newcomers, hoping to welcome more allies into their ranks. The knights marched in, their breath steaming, their fine horses stamping in the cold. Yet among them, there was already talk. Jon heard the word Targaryen, hissed in the air like a brand. He forced a calm expression. The Vale Knights had come for Sansa's sake, for the sake of the Starks. Would they remain if the rightful Stark turned out to be a Targaryen? Uncertainty weighed on him. The night that followed was sullen. The great hall's atmosphere was brittle. People still dined, though the conversation was subdued. Daenerys sat at the high table, Missandei and Grey Worm nearby, with Tyrion Lannister at her side. Jon saw how Tyrion tried to coax her into conversation, but the queen's demeanor remained tense. From across the table, Sansa watched them with that calculating gaze. Brienne stood behind Sansa, stoic and watchful, like a protective sentinel. Jon hovered outside the ring of torchlight. He had little appetite, but he made a show of drinking a cup of ale to calm his nerves. He felt as though the entire hall stared at him every time he moved. He glanced at Daenerys, and for a moment their gazes locked. There had been closeness between them once, hadn't there? She had risked her dragons to save him beyond the wall. He had knelt to her. They had shared a blossoming bond that might have been love, or so he had thought. Now it was overshadowed by the knowledge that they were kin, that fate had twisted both their claims to the Iron Throne, that what might have been between them was unspeakable. The same memory flitted across both their faces. That moment on the ship to White Harbor, her hand in his, her breath warm in the narrow cabin. Jon flushed with shame and confusion. She broke eye contact and rose abruptly. Murmurs rippled through the hall as she swept out, head held high. Tyrion followed. Grey Worm departed soon after. Jon set his mug aside and rubbed his eyes. He did not know how to approach her. He did not know if he could mend the tension that had grown between them. She was still an ally, still the mother of dragons, but the future had darkened between them. He sensed movement at his shoulder and saw Davos approach. "Your Grace," Davos murmured. The words had once felt uncomfortable. Now they were downright surreal, knowing the Targaryen truth. "We should speak in private. Tyrion asked for a meeting with you and the queen." Jon sighed. "Now? He says it's urgent." Jon forced himself to his feet, though exhaustion weighed heavily. He nodded, following Davos out of the hall and into a side chamber warmed by a single brazier. The stone walls were bare, and the only furniture was a heavy wooden table with a few chairs. Daenerys stood there, arms folded, while Tyrion paced. Missandei lingered near the door, watchful. Jon made a slight bow to Daenerys. "Your Grace," he said softly. She gave no outward sign of acceptance or rejection, only a tight nod. Tyrion cleared his throat. "Shall we sit? This conversation may be long." No one sat. They remained standing in a loose circle as a swirl of wind rattled the chamber's shutters. Tyrion sighed and rubbed at his temples. "We face a threat to all of humanity. That was the starting premise of this alliance, yes?" Jon nodded. "Yes." Tyrion's gaze flicked between them. "We cannot afford to let the question of the Iron Throne overshadow the real fight, which is against the dead. And yet, it would be foolish to ignore the massive dragon in the room. The rightful heir of House Targaryen is not necessarily the queen we have followed. Or so the law might say." Daenerys's lips tightened. "Is that how you see me now, Tyrion? An usurper?" Tyrion was quick to raise his hands. "No, Your Grace. I serve you. I believe in you. You have more than law on your side. You have proven leadership, you have dragons, you have tea. He's support of many of the people in Essos who saw you break chains. And the question of legitimacy is not so black and white in Westeros. Many lords would rally behind you simply because you are the one they've heard about, the breaker of chains, the one who has proven she can lead. King's Landing might not care a whit for the northern bastard they barely know. But rumor can still do damage. Whispers of an alternative Targaryen claimant may undermine the alliances we have carefully built." Jon stepped closer, forcibly meeting Daenerys's eyes. "I don't want the throne. I've said that from the start. I bent the knee because I recognized your claim and your strength. The truth doesn't change that. I only told the North because I can't lead them on a lie." Daenerys's expression trembled. "And yet here we are, with half your men gossiping that their king is a Targaryen. A rightful Targaryen. Perhaps they would prefer you on the Iron Throne, especially if we defeat the White Walkers. You underestimate how quickly supporters can shift when they see a chance to elevate someone they consider one of their own." Jon shook his head. "I am not one of their own, not anymore. I'm no one's own. I wish none of this." Tyrion resumed pacing, the flickering brazier light throwing his shadow across the walls. "At present, the biggest danger is fracturing. If the North is split between supporting Jon Snow, the king in the North, or feeling betrayed by the Targaryen heritage, we lose a portion of our forces. If the Southern Lords, once we muster them, catch wind that there is another Targaryen with a stronger claim, they might reevaluate who to follow. And if we begin to fight amongst ourselves, the Night King wins by default." Daenerys exhaled slowly. "Then we must unify them. Is that not the reason I agreed to an alliance? Because we must stand together?" Jon caught a hint of vulnerability in her face. It pained him, the memory of warmth that once had seemed to blossom between them, now overshadowed by the bitter knowledge of their blood connection. "I only ask that you trust me as you did before," he said gently. "We fight for the same cause. The throne can wait." She studied him for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod. "The throne can wait," she echoed, though her voice lacked conviction. "So how do we keep your people from deserting this cause?" Jon clenched his fists at his sides. "I can speak to them. Show them that being Ned Stark's nephew doesn't change my heart. I was raised in the North. I bled for it. That's all I can do." Tyrion cleared his throat. "Well, let us hope that is enough." He paused, grimacing slightly as if the next words pained him. "We also must consider the possibility that some unscrupulous faction tries to exploit this. Queen Cersei, for instance, if she learns the king in the North is actually a Targaryen heir. She might find ways to use that against us." Daenerys nodded, face cold. Then we shall take measures to ensure that truth doesn't travel to King's Landing before we are prepared." They continued talking of war strategies, supply lines, and the distribution of dragonglass. As the hour grew late, Tyrion insisted on ensuring that neither King's Landing nor Euron Greyjoy's fleet would gain the advantage. But Daenerys's mind was half elsewhere, as was Jon's. When at last the conversation ended, she left without speaking another word to him. Jon did not sleep that night. He lay in his old chamber, a place that once had been a symbol of acceptance after his reclamation of Winterfell, but now felt alien. He stared at the rafters. Ghost slept at the foot of the bed, occasionally stirring with little huffs. Jon's mind churned with the memory of Sam and Bran's words, the uncertain future. He found himself longing for simpler times, at the Wall or even at Hardhome, where at least there had been clarity about what needed to be done. Now, in the shifting tapestry of politics and loyalties, he felt more lost than ever. He rose before dawn, threw on a cloak, and wandered into the Godswood. The ancient weirwood's face was still as a statue. Red leaves drifted onto the snow. Jon stood beneath those boughs and wished he could speak to Ned Stark one last time. The man who raised him had withheld so much, yet had done it out of love. Jon tried not to feel anger. His father, no, his uncle, had shielded him from a certain death. But oh, how Jon wished for guidance now. When dawn's first pale light touched the sky, he heard a soft rustle. Bran's chair rolled over the uneven ground. The boy who was no longer fully a boy stopped beside the weirwood. "You're awake early," Bran noted, voice the same distant monotone he often used. Jon gave a small shrug. "I've hardly slept." Bran's gaze settled on the carved face. "Neither have I." They watched the silent tree a moment. Jon noticed how eerily composed Bran was, how his breath rose like a slow ghost in the cold. "Did you see all of this?" Jon asked. "How it would unfold after I revealed the truth?" Bran's pale eyes flickered. "I see possibilities, mostly. It's not so fixed as I once believed. Some points are more inevitable than others. War is inevitable. The dead are inevitable. But how the living fractalize, how they choose, shifts in every moment." Jon wondered at the burden of that power. It was a lonely gift. "Is there anything I can do to keep us united?" Bran's shoulders rose in the faintest shrug. "Speak with them. Remind them of who you are. All the rest is a matter of choice. Even I can't see the outcome fully." Jon closed his eyes. That would have to be enough. He spent the following days trying to unify the Northern Lords, meeting them in small groups or one by one in the courtyard. He explained again and again that he had not chosen his birth, that he had never lied intentionally, that he was still Jon Snow, a man of the North. Some responded with grudging acceptance. Some warmed to him again, remembering his service to the Night's Watch, his victory in the Battle of the Bastards. Yet others remained cold. The name Targaryen had too deep a stain. Jon saw it in their eyes. The memory of the Mad King's cruelty, the fear of Dragonflame. He tried to persuade them that the Mother of Dragons was not her father, and that he was not some vengeful scion of House Targaryen, but the living's best hope. But doubt lingered. Conflict simmered. Fights broke out between the Dothraki and the Northern Foot soldiers, though none escalated into lethal violence yet. Jon spent long hours mediating disputes, with Davos at his side offering calm reason. Sansa wrote letters to hold the Vale's loyalty. Arya stalked the corridors, watchful, as though anticipating betrayal in every shadow. Winterfell itself felt heavier, weighed down by suspicion and the knowledge of an undead army creeping closer every day. Then a raven came from Castle Black. The Night King's forces had overrun the last hearth. The Umbers were gone. Men had scattered south. The dead were coming faster than they had predicted. Panic seized the castle. Preparations that had been slow now accelerated. The blacksmith's forges glowed red day and night, forging dragonglass arrowheads and spear tips. The Unsullied drilled ceaselessly on the snowy grounds. The Knights of the Vale formed new ranks. Jon demanded that they ready the trenches around Winterfell, dig them deep, fill them with wooden spikes tipped in dragonglass. He had the men build catapults on the battlements, store barrels of oil. Time was short. Finally, word came that the Night King's Legion of Whites would reach Winterfell in a matter of days. Jon summoned every fighter to stand ready for the battle of their lives. Daenerys arranged her dragons on the outskirts. She had only two left, Drogon and Rhaegal, the latter ironically named for Jon's father. That unsettled them both. On the parapets, Sansa watched with a drawn face, arms crossed. On the eve of battle, the entire host waited in tense silence. Jon stood in the courtyard among his forces, meeting each man's eyes, giving them small nods, murmuring thanks. He did not know if all would stand. Some might desert or flee in the night, terrified of fighting the undead. But he could not dwell on that. He would remain no matter what. He found Daenerys by the main gate, stroking Rhaegal's scaled neck. The dragon lowered its greenish head, exhaling warm gusts. In that moment, she looked small, overshadowed by the beast's mass. Yet her poise was regal, unwavering. Jon approached slowly. She glanced at him, her face stern, but she did not tell him to go away. "He likes you," she said, nodding to Rhaegal. "He senses your blood." Jon rested a hand on the dragon's side. "I'm not sure how to feel about that." They stood there, listening to the distant clang of arms, the murmur of soldiers' voices. Then, quietly, Daenerys said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, we must fight as one. We cannot be torn by this bloodline. You may not want the throne, but others want you to have it." "I want none of it," Jon said, thinking of the burden that sat on her shoulders. "Truly, let the realm choose after we defeat the Night King. But for now, we fight side by side, or we die." She turned her gaze to him, and he thought he saw a flicker of the closeness they once shared. Her voice trembled faintly. "Then let tomorrow show the realm what that unity looks like." They parted as the horns sounded from the walls. The sun dipped below the horizon, and a bitter wind swept across Winterfell. Snow drifted down in silent drifts. The atmosphere was charged with dread and determination. Soldiers stared into the darkness beyond the walls, waiting for the first sign of the undead horde. Torches flickered on the battlements like fireflies in the gloom. Jon found Ghost near the ramparts, the white direwolf pacing with ears pricked. He stroked the beast's fur. "Stay close," he murmured. "We'll need each other." Ghost licked his gloved hand. The hours crawled. Some men dozed in their positions, only to jolt awake at the slightest sound. Jon paced. Daenerys soared overhead once on Drogon's back, scouting. At last, near midnight, a low horn note sounded thrice from the outer watch. The watchers on the walls tensed. Men rose, eyes wide. Women in the healers' tents exchanged fearful glances. Jon climbed to the battlements. He looked out across the snowy fields. They were no longer empty. A writhing mass of pale figures moved in the moonlight, silent except for the rustle of dead limbs. Thousands upon thousands. In the faint glow, he saw the shimmer of ice-blue eyes. Behind them, tall silhouettes, white walkers perched on dead horses. An army of nightmares. Davos stood at his side, swallowing audibly. "Gods help us." Jon nodded, heart hammering. The time for fear had passed. "Light the trenches," he shouted. Archers dipped their arrowheads into fire and loosed, sending flaming streaks into the darkness. The lines of sharpened stakes flared, casting a flickering orange glow across the plain. The undead did not halt but pressed onward. The front ranks stumbled over the spikes, toppling. More poured around. Some charred as the flames caught them, others crawled through the gaps. Jon raised Longclaw. "Archers, fire. Spearmen, hold the line." Cacophony erupted. The next hours were pure chaos. Arrows rained down. The whites clawed at the walls, built writhing mounds of their own bodies to climb. The Unsullied stood at the front, disciplined and grim, thrusting dragonglass spears into decaying torsos. Knights of the Vale charged, only to be swallowed by a wave of the dead. Shouts and shrieks filled the air. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, gouting flame across the ranks. For a moment it seemed unstoppable, Entire swathes of the undead turned to ash under dragonfire. But the horde was vast, and even Dragonflame had its limits. The White Walkers in the rear raised their spears of ice, hurling them at the dragons. Daenerys deftly swerved Drogon away from a deadly projectile, but Rhaegal took a glancing blow to the flank, roaring in pain. Jon's voice grew hoarse from shouting orders. He rallied the northern warriors, leading a counterattack at one breach in the trenches where the undead poured through. The clang of steel was deafening. He swung Longclaw with fierce precision, each blow felling a wight. They kept coming, an unceasing torrent. Tormund fought beside him, howling curses, hacking with his axe. Ghost leapt into the fray, tearing at skeletal limbs. Jon lost track of time, consumed by the fury of survival. Somewhere in the swirl, he glimpsed Daenerys on foot. Drogon had landed with a wound, roaring defiance. She torched a line of wights with a blast of dragon flame, but more advanced, clambering over the charred remains. Grey Worm led the Unsullied around her, forming a protective circle. She tried to reach Drogon to mount him again, but the press of wights was too thick. In a surge of will, Jon tore through the undead in front of him and dashed toward her, shouting, "Daenerys!" She turned, eyes alight with fierce resolve, but the knight behind her was alive with the dead. He raised Longclaw to cut down a ghoul that lunged from the side. Firelight glinted off its lifeless eyes as it crumpled. Daenerys swung a dragonglass-tipped spear at another. They met in the swirl of chaos, side by side. "Get to Drogon!" Jon roared over the din. She nodded, whirling to see Drogon being swarmed by climbing corpses. The great beast lashed his tail, scorching the ground, but more clung to him. Daenerys forced her way forward, Grey Worm and Jon at her side. A spear glanced off her shoulder, slicing through her cloak. She cried out but pressed on. At last they reached Drogon. Jon and Grey Worm hacked the wights from his scaled sides. Daenerys seized the chance to climb onto the saddle. Drogon roared and launched upward in a flurry of wings, scattering the dead. Jon looked up, relieved, until a flash of silver caught his eye. An icy spear soared from the far side of the battlefield, aimed straight at Drogon's underbelly. Daenerys saw it too late. Drogon twisted midair, avoiding a direct strike, but the spear sank into his flank. The dragon shrieked, flames belching uncontrollably. Daenerys clung on, face contorted in terror. Drogon tried to stay aloft, wings flailing, but the wound was deep. He spiraled down, crashing into a snowbank well inside the castle perimeter. Men scattered. Daenerys was thrown from the saddle, hitting the ground with a cry of pain. Jon's heart lurched. He sprinted as fast as he could, ignoring the dead that lunged at him. He did not see if Grey Worm followed, or if Tormund fell behind him. Everything was a blur of black shapes and shrieking horror. Reaching Daenerys, he dropped to a knee, breath ragged. Her left arm hung limp. Blood trickled from her temple. Drogon still thrashed, tail smacking aside wights that sought to tear at his flesh, but the beast was grievously injured. Jon roared for help. Davos and a handful of men rushed over, forming a defensive circle. "Get her inside," Jon shouted. "Davos, take her to the maesters." Daenerys's eyes snapped open, filled with stubborn resolve. "No," she gasped, pushing weakly at Jon. "I must Drogon." Jon clasped her hand. "He's done for now. You've done enough. We have to get you safe." A half-lie. There was no safe place here, but at least the Great Hall might shelter her from the immediate melee, giving the healers a chance to help. Reluctantly, she let Davos and 2 soldiers lift her. Tears slid down her cheeks as she watched Drogon roar, unleashing a last blast of flame. Then, stumbling, she was taken away. Jon rose, turning back to the swirl of undead. Rhaegal still soared overhead, less confident, reeling from his wound. The White Walkers advanced, their frosty armor glinting in the light of distant fires. In the recesses of the darkness, Jon could sense an even darker presence. The Night King. He led the men back into the fray, every muscle burning. The hours stretched in a delirious haze. Somewhere, horns signaled the riders of the Vale to sweep in and regroup. The undead reformed in waves. Through it all, Sansa remained behind the walls, coordinating evacuations, sending more dragonglass arrows to the front. Arya darted in the shadows, lethal as a whisper, her blade dancing. Jon glimpsed her from time to time, a silent reaper among the dead. The entire world seemed on fire and ice. Then, beyond the lines, he saw a figure on an undead horse, crowned with an icy helm. The Night King. Their eyes met across the battlefield. An unspoken challenge. Jon's breath caught in his throat. He knew that if the Night King fell, the Whites would crumble. But the White Walkers formed a protective phalanx around him, drifting through the chaos with unearthly calm. Jon clenched Longclaw, ignoring the fatigue in his limbs. This was their chance. If he could reach the Night King, he signaled Tormund, Grey Worm, and a group of knights. "We break through," Jon shouted. "We end this now." They charged. The dead resisted in a sickening wave of clawing hands and snapping jaws. But desperation gave Jon's group a wild edge. They hacked forward. Jon felt something primal surge in his chest. He cut down Whites with savage fury, determined to clear a path. Tormund's war cries echoed. The clang of dragonglass on bone was deafening. Little by little they advanced. But the White Walkers would not relent. One brandished an ice spear, stepping forth to meet Jon's challenge. Their weapons collided. Jon's Valyrian steel parried the unnatural ice. Sparks flew. The Walker's strength was immense, each blow rattling Jon's bones. He gritted his teeth, returning strike for strike. Finally, with a swift slash, he shattered the Walker's weapon and plunged Longclaw through its chest. The creature dissolved into glittering shards. Another Walker moved in, but Grey Worm, battered and bloodied, lunged with his spear. The Walker disintegrated under the dragonglass tip. Tormund tackled a White that threatened to bite Jon's unguarded flank. They were close now, so close. The Night King loomed only a few dozen yards away, an impassive specter among swirling snow. Then the Night King raised his arms. Jon felt dread coil in his gut. Corpses, both friend and foe, began to stir. The newly dead opened their milky eyes, rising from the ground. Some were northern soldiers who had just fallen. Others were already half-skeleton. The ultimate horror. The enemy's ranks replenishing before his eyes. Tormund cursed. Grey Worm hissed in despair. But Jon pressed forward. He couldn't stop. If he turned back now, the new wave would trap them anyway. He heard the screech of Regal overhead, saw a burst of dragon flame. The White Walkers parted. The Night King's face remained implacable. Jon broke into a run, slashing aside the reanimated corpses that grabbed at him. Each footstep felt like wading through thick mud. He could see the swirl of cold emanating from the Night King, hear the unearthly hush that followed him. Closer, 20 paces, 10. A shape loomed in from his periphery, a massive white giant, half its flesh rotted away. It crashed into Jon's flank, sending him sprawling into the snow. Longclaw flew from his hand. Pain flared in his shoulder. The giant roared, flecks of dead flesh falling from its jaws. Jon struggled to roll away, grabbing at the ground. The giant's huge foot stomped down, narrowly missing him. Splinters of ice shot up. He rolled beneath the monstrous leg, searching frantically for a weapon. The giant stooped, huge hand groping to snatch him. Jon twisted aside, seizing a broken spear of dragonglass from a corpse. He stabbed upward. The spear punked, yawed the giant's leathery hide near the waist. With a shriek, the giant collapsed to its knees, half pinned by its own decaying weight. Jon scrambled away, trembling. He had no time to see if it was truly dead. More Whites advanced. Then came a roar of fury and the hiss of steel. Arya leapt into view, brandishing her Valyrian steel dagger. She landed on the giant's shoulder and stabbed downward, piercing something vital. The giant jerked once, then collapsed for good, ice crystals spreading from the wound. Arya jumped clear, her face pale but fierce. She spotted Jon, breathing hard. "You still alive?" she asked, her voice taut. "For now," he replied, staggering to his feet. He searched for Longclaw in the churned snow, heart pounding. More undead closed in. Arya flung herself at them, a deadly wraith, but she was only one fighter, and there were too many. Jon found Longclaw half-buried, pulled it free, then pivoted. He saw the Night King retreating into the thick ranks of whites. Another ring of White Walkers emerged to defend him. A surge of undead parted them from the Night King's silhouette. The chance was slipping away. "Come on!" Jon shouted to Arya, then to the ragged group behind them. Tormund was still upright, howling curses, half his face caked in blood. Grey Worm looked at him with desperate resolve. They formed a wedge, hacking their way toward the Night King's position. The dead pressed in from all sides. The stench of decay mingled with the copper tang of blood. Sweat and snow stung Jon's eyes. Every swing of his blade felt heavier than the last. One by one, men fell, snatched down by whites or skewered by White Walkers' ice weapons. Jon felt a sense of creeping doom. Could they possibly break through in time? Suddenly, from above, regal dove low, a torrent of greenish flame sweeping across the whites. The White Walkers scattered, and the Night King halted, turning his icy gaze skyward. Jon saw an opening. "Now!" he roared. They surged forward, cutting through scorched whites that flailed aimlessly. The Night King raised a hand to summon some dark magic. But in that instant, Regal's flames whooshed down in a searing column. The Night King vanished in fire for a heartbeat. Hope flared in Jon. But then the flames parted around an aura of freezing air. The Night King emerged, unburned, ice spear in hand. He hurled it at Regal with supernatural force. The dragon lurched, struck again. With a guttural shriek, it crashed onto the battlefield in a tumble of wings. Jon felt a pang of horror. Regal writhed in the snow, mortally wounded, flames sputtering from its maw. The Night King advanced, ignoring the chaos, stepping steadily toward the fallen beast. Jon realized with a fresh stab of terror that if the Night King touched Regal, he might raise the dragon as an undead abomination. They could not allow that. "Cover me!" Jon bellowed. He sprinted at the Night King, raising Longclaw. Tormund and Arya fought to keep the whites off him. Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied joined the push. The Night King turned at Jon's approach, expressionless. Jon swung with all his might. The Night King caught the blade with an ice sword, and for a moment, the ring of impact split the night. They traded blows, the power of the Night King almost inhuman. Each clash sent shockwaves through Jon's arms. He gritted his teeth, pressing the attack, searching for a gap in the Night King's unearthly defense. The whites surged around them, but Tormund and Arya kept them at bay for a fleeting moment. Jon lunged, aiming for the Night King's flank. The ice sword intercepted him. A backhand blow knocked Jon off balance, sending him stumbling. The Night King raised his weapon to strike a killing blow. Jon barely managed to parry, the force driving him to his knees. He felt the cold seeping into his bones. Suddenly, Grey Worm darted forward, spear in hand. He thrust the dragonglass tip at the Night King's exposed side. But the Night King twisted with inhuman speed, batting the spear away. The recoil slammed Grey Worm to the ground. Tormund rushed in, only to be flung aside by a wave of white frost emanating from the Night King's outstretched hand. Panting, Jon tried to rise, but the Night King seized him by the throat with an iron grip. Frost spread across Jon's skin. He struggled, the world darkening at the edges. He remembered all he had fought for, all who would die if he failed. With a last burst of will, he snarled and drove Longclaw upward, blindly. He felt the blade pierce something. The Night King released him, staggering a half-step back. Longclaw's Valyrian steel glowed with pale, reflected light. The Night King looked down at the blade buried in his abdomen. An otherworldly shriek escaped him. Cracks of ice spread across his body, fracturing him from within. Jon scrambled free, gasping for air. Arya and Grey Worm watched from a few yards away, eyes wide, as the Night King shattered. His body broke into shards that dissolved into icy dust. The White Walkers around them shrieked, then crumbled. The Whites collapsed en masse, their animating force gone in an instant. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of dying flames and the ragged breathing of survivors. Jon knelt in the snow, trembling. The Night King was gone. It was over. The war for the dawn had been won. Arya knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his shoulder, eyes shimmering with relief. Tormund roared triumph, half laughing, half sobbing. Grey Worm stood, battered and bloodied, looking around as if in disbelief. All across the battlefield, the dead lay still. Smoke drifted in patches. Torn banners fluttered in the faint breeze. The night sky above bore witness to a victory that had cost thousands of lives. Winterfell's walls stood, battered but unbroken. Jon forced himself upright, leaning on Arya. He surveyed the carnage. Soldiers wept openly. Some cheered in broken voices. Others merely stared, numb. His gaze found Regal, lying motionless, a thick spear of ice jutting from the dragon's neck. The valiant beast had given its last breath. Jon closed his eyes briefly, sorrow mixing with exhaustion. Then he remembered Daenerys. He mustered what strength he had left and stumbled toward the castle proper, searching for her among the wounded. Men parted before him, awe and reverence in their eyes. He had slain the Night King. Yet Jon felt no triumph, only a weary sense of relief that the realm was spared annihilation. He found Daenerys in the great hall, propped against the dais, her arm in a makeshift sling. The maester was tending to a gash on her forehead. Davos hovered nearby. When she saw Jon approach, her face flickered with a mix of emotions. "It's done," Jon said quietly, voice rough. "The Night King is dead." She exhaled slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And Regal?" she asked, though the look in her eyes suggested she knew the answer. Jon lowered his gaze. "He's gone. I'm sorry." She pressed her lips together, closing her eyes. A single tear traced down her cheek. A hush settled over the survivors in the hall. Sansa emerged from a corridor, flanked by Brienne. Arya slipped in behind Jon, eyes glittering with adrenaline. The weight of what had happened pressed upon them all. At length, Daenerys opened her eyes, meeting Jon's gaze with an intensity that made his heart pound. "You saved us," she whispered. "You killed the Night King." "Not alone," Jon replied hoarsely. "Arya, Tormund, Grey Worm, everyone fought." She inclined her head in acknowledgement, but her eyes did not leave his. In that gaze, he saw not only gratitude, but the swirl of everything left unspoken. Their shared Targaryen blood, the throne, the losses. They were alive, yet what awaited them in the aftermath might prove equally fraught. Even so, they had survived the long night. All around them, the survivors wept or prayed or stood in numbed relief. Outside, in the courtyard, the first pink rays of dawn caught on the fallen snow. Firelight flickered against the battered walls. From the broken parapets to the courtyard now strewn with corpses, Winterfell stood as a testament to their endurance, though at a staggering cost in blood. Jon gently grasped Daenerys's uninjured hand. "We'll see to the wounded," he murmured. "We'll bury the dead, and then we'll decide what comes next. Together." She returned his grip, her face etched with pain and lingering sorrow, but also a fierce resolve. "Together," she echoed, voice trembling. Sansa approached quietly, eyes on Daenerys. For a moment, the two women shared a look that was not quite friendly, but not as cold as before. Sansa nodded, and Daenerys inclined her head. The White Walkers were gone. They had achieved a unity of purpose. But soon, the living would turn their eyes to the future, and to the question of a Targaryen heir, a Targaryen queen, and who truly deserved the Iron Throne. Yet for that fragile moment, in the hush after the great battle, a sense of wonder took hold. Jon glanced around the great hall at his sisters, his friends, Daenerys, Grey Worm, Davos, and the battered forms of men and women who had clung to the hope he offered. He might be Aegon Targaryen by blood, but in spirit, He felt as he always had, the boy from Winterfell shaped by Ned Stark's honor. He only prayed that honor would guide him through the trials to come. The next days blurred in an exhausting aftermath of clearing rubble, burning corpses, caring for the wounded. The stench was overwhelming, thousands of rotting whites, tens of thousands of severed limbs. Pyres lined the outer courtyards, thick smoke drifting toward a gray sky. The few surviving knights of the Vale prepared to return home, though Sansa convinced many to remain for a time, in case more help was needed to quell smaller pockets of undead. But it seemed the magic animating the whites had truly vanished with the Night King. They found only scattered clumps of bodies that twitched aimlessly, easily put down. Jon spent most of his time in the yard, helping drag broken timbers off fallen men, comforting weeping survivors. Ghosts stayed close to him, muzzle blood-stained, equally exhausted. At one pyre, Jon recognized the fallen form of Beric Dondarrion, body riddled with wounds from which no miracle would revive him this time. At another, Ed Tollett's body. Jon's heart ached, but tears would not come. He was too drained. He noticed how the lords of the North looked at him differently. Some gazed with awe bordering on reverence. He had slain the Night King, an act that would pass into legend. Others seemed wary, as though not sure if he was a hero or a threat to the old order. Lady Mormont's body was borne away with honor, killed when a white giant had broken into the castle. Jon felt each loss as a personal wound. This was the cost of war. By the third day, Daenerys emerged from within the keep, walking on her own but with bandages around her shoulder and arm. Her face was set in grim lines. She insisted on attending a funeral pyre for Drogon's fallen brother, Rhaegal. They had dragged the immense carcass beyond the walls. Even in death, the dragon was breathtaking. Daenerys touched his snout one last time, tears sliding down her cheeks. Drogon circled overhead, keening mournfully. Jon watched from a short distance, his heart twisting at the raw sorrow in her eyes. She had lost two dragons now, Viserion and Rhaegal. Only Drogon remained, wounded but alive. When the pyre was lit, greenish flames danced over Rhaegal's scales. The heat was searing, driving many onlookers back. Daenerys stood as close as she could bear, her hair whipping around in the updraft. Jon approached and gently placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder. She stiffened at first, but then relaxed slightly. They stood in silence, watching the last of Rhaegal turn to ash. That evening, as the fires outside the gates smoldered, the gathered survivors assembled in the great hall for a solemn feast. They had lost so many that the hall felt hollow, but the living still drew breath, and the North believed in honoring those who fought. Jon sat at the head table with Sansa, Arya, Daenerys, Davos, and Tyrion. The mood was subdued. Some men attempted laughter, but it rang hollow. The ale flowed, yet no one forgot the bitterness of the cost. Midway through the meal, Tyrion rose to propose a toast, referencing the sacrifice of the fallen and the heroism of the living. He made a special mention of Jon, the king in the north, who had destroyed the Night King with his Valyrian steel blade. A ragged cheer followed, though some faces remained uncertain. Sansa glanced at Jon. He felt uncomfortable under their collective gaze. When Tyrion sat, Daenerys cleared her throat. The hush fell anew. She stood, wincing slightly at her shoulder, and gazed over the hall. "We have done the impossible," she said, voice resonant. "We have banished the darkness that threatened to end the world of men. We have lost dearly, but we have prevailed. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, has done us a service that can never be repaid." Her eyes flicked to him, shining with complex emotion. "I came to Westeros to claim the Iron Throne, but in this fight we have all learned there are greater causes. The living, the future." She paused, letting the echoes settle. "Tonight, I say to all of you, let no difference of blood or birth or name stand between us. We are the children of this land, and we must rebuild it together." Her speech drew stares, some grudging nods, some applause. Sansa's gaze was guarded. Davos raised his mug. Jon inclined his head, feeling a wave of gratitude. She was extending an olive branch, urging acceptance of him despite his Targaryen heritage. If Daenerys could do that, perhaps the realm could. After the feast, as the crowd dissipated into pockets of conversation and quiet reflection, Jon slipped outside into the cold to clear his head. He walked along the courtyard, the torches fluttering in the frigid breeze. The battered ramparts loomed overhead, snow drifting in the corners. Ghost trotted beside him. The hush of the night felt strangely comforting after the din of the hall. He made his way to the Godswood, seeking the ancient weirwood once more. Soft footsteps followed. He turned to see Arya, her hood drawn up, face partially shadowed. "Can't sleep?" he asked, voice low. She shrugged. "I'm restless. Can't get the stench of death out of my nose." He nodded in understanding. For a while, they walked in silence beneath the red leaves. Finally, Arya spoke. "When you revealed the truth about your father, or your father's father, did you expect it would turn out like this?" Jon exhaled, a soft, tired sound. "I didn't know what to expect. I thought the truth was better than lies. Still do, but it's not an easy truth." Arya's gray eyes searched his face. "You're still my brother, you know," she said quietly. "No matter what name they give you, you're my brother, and that's all that matters to me." Emotion welled in Jon's chest. He reached out and drew her into a hug, which she returned with a fierce grip. The ghosts of the past hovered around them, the memories of their shared childhood. She stepped back, clearing her throat. "But you should know," Sansa's concerned. "She knows the lords are uncertain. Some might push for you to take the throne. Others might want you out of the picture entirely. You've become important. Too important, maybe." He closed his eyes. "If that's the case, I'll address it. I won't let the realm tear itself apart over who rules. We've just survived the long night. We deserve peace." "Peace," Arya echoed. "I hope the world still remembers how to live in peace." After all this death, they parted ways, each lost in private thoughts. As Jon stood by the weirwood's face, he brushed a hand along the carved grooves, thinking of the father who had raised him. Ned Stark had taught him that honesty and loyalty were everything, but the world repaid those virtues with blood. Yet somehow they had survived. The war with the dead was over. The living had another chance. In the coming weeks, the North would bury its dead, patch its walls, salvage what it could of the ravaged countryside. The snows began to lessen. Spring, or something akin to it, might be on the horizon. Ravens flew out from Winterfell, announcing the defeat of the Night King to the rest of Westeros. Jon knew the message would stir hearts, perhaps even unify them, but it would also carry news that the king in the north was of Targaryen blood, that Daenerys Targaryen still lived, and that a new question now loomed: who would rule the Seven Kingdoms? Sansa busied herself with reorganizing the stewardships, rebuilding alliances with northern houses that had lost heirs in the battle. She acted as a capable regent, her presence giving the lords confidence that House Stark still stood. Arya, restless, vanished for days on scouting missions, ensuring no whites lingered. Bran retreated more and more into his visions, speaking rarely, drifting away from the daily concerns of the living. Daenerys remained in Winterfell, healing from her injuries. Drogon recovered slowly, restless in the cold. Each day, Jon sensed the tension in her. She had lost 2 dragons, nearly lost her life, yet she had come out of this with more respect from the north. And overshadowing all, the knowledge that by the laws of succession, Jon was the rightful king of Westeros. It was a bitter irony. Jon visited her one morning in the solar, where a small fire crackled in the hearth. She sat in a wooden chair by the window, gazing out at the courtyard where men trained with leftover dragonglass spears. She wore a simpler gown than usual, her silver-gold hair pulled back in a single braid. When she turned to look at him, her expression was pensive. "You're walking without pain?" Jon asked, noticing she wore no sling. She nodded. "It's better. The maester says I'll have the scar for life, but I've lived through worse." He approached, the tension in his chest mounting. "I wanted to speak with you about what comes next." She gave a small nod. "Yes, Tyrion has told me that my troops are eager to march south. The Iron Throne remains in Cersei's clutches. That was always our war, before the army of the dead turned our attention north. Now that the dead are gone, Jon paced, arms folded. You know I have no desire for that throne. But as your advisor and relative, it seems I should accompany you to King's Landing if you go. She rose from her chair, walking slowly to the fire. Her eyes flicked to him. If I go, she repeated softly. Is there a question about whether I will? He hesitated. You've lost so much, Daenerys. Your dragons, your people. Are you certain you want to keep fighting? She closed her eyes. I must. I cannot let the woman who murdered my allies sit on the throne unchallenged. The people of Westeros deserve a just ruler. I swore to break the wheel. Jon watched the flames reflect on her face, remembering how unstoppable she had once seemed, crowned by fire and blood. She had the unwavering conviction of a conqueror. Even battered, she would not abandon her birthright. Then I will do what I can to support you, but there are those in the north who might prefer that I claim the throne. I won't do it, but they may try to push me. She turned abruptly. Then make them see you won't do it. Her voice was tight. Or if you do, at least tell me now. He blinked. I told you already, I have no wish to be king. You have my word. I only wish to secure peace. She stared at him a long moment, then her posture softened. I believe you, she said quietly, but that doesn't mean the realm will. So we must be careful. We must resent a united front. If we appear divided, if they think you're a rival claimant, I'll make it clear I'm not, Jon interrupted. Daenerys nodded, tension easing slightly. She stepped closer, eyes flickering over his face. I know I was distant, she murmured. When I found out I couldn't bear it, the thought that we shared blood, that everything had changed. But you saved us even after learning that truth, and I don't know what the future holds. I only know we must face it together. Targaryen or Stark or both. We must find a way. He nodded, heart heavy. They stood close enough that he could feel her warmth. Once he might have embraced her. Now, an invisible barrier stood between them, a boundary neither knew how to cross. Instead, he bowed his head. I'll stand with you, he said simply. She reached for his hand, a fleeting contact. Then she withdrew, turning back to the window. Then we'll take the realm together, or die trying. In the weeks that followed, the North continued to rebuild, though the scars were everywhere. Word spread that Daenerys planned to march south, to finally dethrone Cersei Lannister. Some soldiers cheered. Fighting for the queen who had saved them from the undead might be more appealing than returning to ravaged fields. Others muttered that the North had done its part and should remain independent. Rumors swirled. That Jon Snow was the real Targaryen king, that he would supplant Daenerys, that the two would marry to unify their claims, that the Starks would rebel. With so many whispered rumors, the mood turned anxious. Sansa and Arya approached Jon one evening, urging caution. If you leave Winterfell with your armies, Sansa said, you leave the North vulnerable. The people might not understand. Some of the lords already feel used. Fight the dead, then march south to fight another war? They resent it. Arya leaned against the wall, arms folded. You're giving up your home for a queen who might not be any better than the others. You told us she was different, but is she truly? She might want that throne too much. Jon bristled slightly. She gave everything to help us. She lost 2 dragons and half her army. If not for her, we'd all be dead under the Night King's horde. Sansa's gaze was steady. Perhaps, but the North will not forget that cost so quickly. We have a chance to remain free of southern wars. We have bled for too many kings and queens. Jon exhaled, facing them both. I understand, but if Cersei remains on the throne, she'll come for us eventually. She won't tolerate the North's independence. We cannot isolate ourselves while an enemy who despises us rules the South. Daenerys and I must finish this, or it will finish us. Arya's eyes narrowed. I'll stay here then with Sansa. will keep the North safe in your absence. Just know that if Daenerys shows any sign of betraying you, I'll come for her myself." Jon's heart squeezed. "Arya," she lifted a finger. "I mean it. She may have helped us, but I won't see you used as a pawn in some Targaryen game." Sansa nodded in agreement, though more diplomatically. "We'll protect Winterfell. You do what you must in the south. But remember who you truly are. A Stark at heart, no matter what your blood." He felt a twinge of gratitude and grief. Nodding, he embraced them. "I'll be back," he said quietly, though he wondered if he would. Another war awaited, and no one could predict how it would end. Thus began the preparations for another campaign. Daenerys rallied her Unsullied, the remnants of the Dothraki, and those northern bannermen still willing to fight under Jon's lead. Many did volunteer, citing loyalty to the man who had saved them from the undead. Others balked, wanting no part of southern politics. Lady Mormont was gone, and the new leaders of Bear Island were torn. Some houses refused outright. Still, a respectable force took shape, enough to challenge Cersei, especially with one dragon still living. Drogon circled overhead, fully healed, an awe-inspiring reminder of Targaryen might. When the day came to depart, the gates of Winterfell creaked open. Snow whirled across the courtyard as Daenerys, Jon, and Tyrion rode out at the head of a column. Grey Worm marched the Unsullied in tight formation. The Northern Knights followed, led by Lord Serwyn and a handful of other loyal lords. Davos, loyal as ever, rode near Jon. The hoofbeats crunched in the snow. Atop the battlements, Sansa and Arya watched, their fur cloaks billowing in the wind. Bran sat beside them in his wheeled chair, expression distant as always. Jon lifted a hand in farewell. Sansa nodded, solemn, and Arya's face remained impassive. Then Winterfell receded behind them, a gray stone silhouette against the bleak horizon. Jon wondered if he would see his home again, or if the Games of Thrones would devour them all. He could only cling to the hope that they had sacrificed enough already, that fate would grant Westeros a measure of peace at last. Yet deep inside, he knew this next conflict might be as perilous as the long night, for men's hearts could be darker than any winter, and old hatreds died hard. As their column stretched south, Daenerys guided Drogon overhead, the living embodiment of House Targaryen's power. Jon rode at the front of the ground forces, silent but resolute. He was the man who had united the living against the dead, who carried a name that both enthralled and frightened the realm. Some called him the prince that was promised. Others saw him as a bastard-turned hero, and yet others saw him as the rightful Targaryen king. What if revealing his heritage sooner had changed the course of loyalties in the north? It had. The north was divided, uncertain, but still they marched for him. For better or worse, they followed the man they had chosen, whose lineage he had not chosen for himself. Only time would tell whether that lineage would unite or forever sunder the realm. Still, the wind whipped around them, and the sun glinted off distant peaks. The army pressed forward, determined to face Cersei Lannister's cunning, the Golden Company's blades, and any other perils the South might hold. Were loomed again. But now, at least, the living had a chance to shape a new future, unshackled from the terror of the Night King. Jon urged his horse onward, the banner of House Stark fluttering behind him, side by side with the banner of House Targaryen. Two sigils, one of a direwolf, the other of a dragon, joined in uneasy alliance, a reflection of Jon's own blood. He did not know where it would lead, but for once he dared to believe that the realm might survive, and that in its survival there could be hope. In the hush of the cold morning, the sound of marching men and the roar of a distant dragon resonated across the frozen fields. The wheel of fate turned once more, and Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, rode south, ready to face whatever trials awaited him, determined to prove that love of the living and the honor of a Stark's upbringing could triumph over the ambitions that had torn Westeros apart for generations. The path ahead was fraught, but he would walk it, sword in hand, heart resolute, for the sake of the home he had always cherished, and for a future that could finally be free. They left Winterfell with the gray clouds low on the horizon. A hush over the courtyard as the gates groaned open and the columns of men and horses funneled onto the King's Road. The early light was pale, washing the world in a dull whiteness. Snow drifted in small flurries, blown by occasional gusts of bitter wind that carried the scent of char and pyres, remnants of the great battle against the dead. Winterfell itself stood behind them like a dark citadel, its walls newly patched but still pocked with battle scars. High on the ramparts, Sansa, Arya, and Bran watched the host depart, their figures half lost in the swirling snow. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, rode at the head of the column on a sturdy northern horse. He wore black armor with the stark direwolf sigil at the shoulders, for in his heart he remained bound to the house that raised him, even if his blood said otherwise. The standard behind him merged Stark gray and Targaryen crimson in uneasy alliance, fluttering and snapping in the wind. Far overhead, the black shape of Drogon passed across the sky, Daenerys mounted on his back. The dragon's cries echoed like distant thunder. A large contingent of Unsullied marched at the head of the infantry, led by Grey Worm. Behind them came the Northern Knights still willing to ride south, their banners fluttering. Serwyn, Manderley, Glover, or what was left of that house, and several smaller houses bruised by recent wars. Some men from the Vale had chosen to accompany them as well, each wearing the Falcon sigil and carrying memories of the battle for the living. Tormund Giantsbane had departed for the true north a few days earlier, taking a group of free folk who had no interest in fighting more southern squabbles, as they called them. Still, a handful of wildlings had remained by Jon's side, out of loyalty to the man who'd proven he could lead them through impossible odds. Davos Seaworth rode near Jon, swaddled in a thick cloak. His expression was grave. No one felt much like talking, and the first days southbound were marked by a somber quiet. Outside the castle's protective walls, the winter wind cut like knives. They followed the King's Road in a long train, accompanied by the rumble of wagons bearing supplies. Among those wagons were casks of dragonglass, leftovers from the stockpile that had proven so vital against the dead. Even now, in the aftermath of the long night, no one wished to discard a weapon of proven worth. Whether it might serve them again was uncertain, but the realm had learned too often that it was always wise to be prepared. Jon spent much of those early hours deep in thought. Ghost padded along near the front, bristling at any unfamiliar rider who ventured too close. At intervals, Tyrion Lannister rode up to check on morale, wearing a heavy fur-trimmed cloak that didn't quite hide his Lannister colors. Tyrion attempted a few observations about the countryside or the weather, but conversation soon lapsed. Everyone felt the weight of the future pressing on their minds. Daenerys landed Drogon near their makeshift camp on the first night, the beast's immense wings scattering freshly fallen snow. Soldiers scrambled back, uneasy even after weeks fighting alongside a dragon. Daenerys dismounted stiffly. Her shoulder still pained her from the wound she'd received at Winterfell. As she walked among the tents, the men parted respectfully, but Jon saw wariness in some faces. Though she had saved them from the dead, there remained an ingrained northern distrust of Targaryens, and, for some, the knowledge that Jon himself was won by blood. "They'll come around," Davos told Jon when he noticed Jon's troubled expression. "Or if not, at least they'll keep their swords pointed at Cersei for now. No use squabbling on the road." Jon wanted to believe it. He and Daenerys might present a united front, but the realm's wounds ran deep, and men's hearts were fickle. Nonetheless, the march continued. Moat Cailin, that ancient fortress dominating the Neck, loomed into view by the fifth day. Its mossy towers and collapsed walls looked half-sunken into the marshland, but it remained a strategic choke point for any army heading south from the north. Many times in the past, these ruins had repelled invaders. Yet now, the men posted their waved Stark banners in recognition of Jon's approach. There was no hostility. The Watchers simply opened the way, allowing the army to pass amid half-flooded causeways. Jon recalled how Theon Greyjoy once took Moat Cailin in a misguided attempt to secure the north. How many wars had it witnessed? Too many, and now they brought yet another. When Daenerys flew overhead on Drogon, the Watchers at the moat cowered, uncertain and fearful, but no attack came. The Targaryen queen soared on by, offering only a cursory glance at the ancient battlements. They camped just beyond the swamps, in a drier clearing that allowed them to pitch tents. A crisp wind whined through slender reeds, carrying the smells of damp earth. Grey Worm directed the Unsullied to form a perimeter, as he always did. A few Dothraki remained, those who had survived the undead apocalypse, and they patrolled restlessly and used to the marshy terrain. Meanwhile, Tyrion brought news from further south. "We've had ravens from the riverlands," Tyrion said, meeting Jon, Daenerys, and Davos around a low-burning fire that evening. He held a small scroll, eyes flicking over it in the firelight. "House Tully has reasserted some influence there. Edmure Tully tries to keep the peace. Word has spread of our victory over the Night King, so some lords express willingness to help dethrone Cersei. Others remain cautious. The Freys are gone, but the scars they left remain. Many prefer to hold their swords behind their walls, not trusting any queen, Lannister or Targaryen." Jon nodded, arms folded. "We'll need to secure their neutrality at least so we can march unopposed. If they won't fight with us, that's fine, but they must not hinder us or ally with Cersei." Tyrion glanced at Daenerys. "If you wish it, Your Grace, I can attempt negotiations with Edmure Tully. He's an honorable sort, somewhat timid, but he has the Tully name and that might go a long way." Daenerys considered, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes, send him word. If he's wise, he'll see that Cersei is no friend to the Riverlands. The Lannisters have never been kind to that region." Jon added quietly, "He's my uncle by marriage, in a way. Perhaps Sansa can send a letter as well, appealing to him as family." Daenerys met Jon's gaze briefly, then nodded. "Do it. We'll travel swiftly, and if House Tully chooses to help us, we'll welcome them. If not, at least we'll not waste time besieging their castles." So the march pressed on, the wind shifting from an icy northerly gale to a humid southern breeze as they passed the neck. The swampy land gave way to the gentle valleys of the upper riverlands. Winter's grip had begun to loosen, though the land still lay in a gray hush, patches of snow stubbornly clinging to the ground. Occasionally, outriders brought reports of scattered bandits or broken men left over from previous conflicts. Jon sent small patrols to chase them off, striving to keep the main army unharassed. All along the route, rumors traveled faster than their banners. Word of the Targaryen queen's approach, and the newly revealed Targaryen king, reached hamlets and holdfast days before the army itself arrived. Curious farmers peered from thatched huts. Children gaped at the sight of a living dragon overhead. Some travelers eagerly insisted Daenerys was the savior who had destroyed the army of the dead, while others claimed the real hero was the man called Jon Snow, rumored to have hidden silver hair and dragon's blood in his veins. Thus the swirl of half-truths and gossip churned, complicating the image the Alliance hoped to project. Wherever they stopped, Daenerys made an effort to show mercy, distributing spare rations or paying for supplies. Jon also walked among the small folk, reassuring them that their fight was against the Lannisters, not the common people. Tyrion did his part with coin and measured words, mindful of appearances. Still, the Northerners traveling with them cast wary eyes on the Riverlands, remembering old conflicts. The tension simmered in the ranks, held at bay only by the memory that they had faced a greater enemy together. They had survived the apocalypse. A petty war for the throne seemed almost manageable by comparison. Before long, they reached the Trident, where the broad river glided under a gray winter sky. They forded it carefully, with Daenerys scouring the region for any sign of Lannister outriders. None were spotted. Their greatest concern remained Cersei's possible alliances. The Golden Company had arrived in King's Landing some time ago, financed by the Crown's coffers and Euron Greyjoy's assistance. The Iron Fleet lurked at sea, presumably prowling around the Blackwater Bay or Storm's End. On a chill morning before they crossed into the heart of the Riverlands, a group of riders approached under a white banner. Jon and Grey Worm were on watch, with the Unsullied braced in ranks. The riders bore no sigil at first glance, only a simple pale standard indicating parley. Jon recognized the man in the lead, an older knight with auburn hair, carrying himself stiffly. Beside him rode Edmure Tully himself, looking careworn but upright in the saddle, the Tully fish emblazoned on his surcoat. They came forward slowly, halting at a respectful distance. Edmure raised a hand in greeting. Jon dismounted, heart fluttering at the sight of Catelyn Stark's brother, the rightful lord of Riverrun. Edmure's eyes flicked from Jon to the unsullied ranks, then to Daenerys in the sky, where Drogon's black shape circled. Jon nodded. "Lord Edmure, I'm glad you came. I sent word by Raven just a few days ago." Edmure's tone was formal. "We received it, yes. I've come to speak with the king in the north, or the Targaryen king. I suppose we must sort out what to call you." Jon gave a tired smile. "Jon Snow is enough, my lord. The rest is complicated." Edmure looked past Jon, scanning the lines of Unsullied and the battered northern knights. "I'm told that you and the queen, Daenerys Targaryen, defeated the Night King at Winterfell. The entire realm owes you a debt." "We all fought," Jon corrected. "We lost many, but yes, the long night is over. Now we move against Cersei Lannister, who still sits the Iron Throne." Edmure dismounted with some difficulty, passing the reins to his companion. "We Tullys have no love for House Lannister. They kept me prisoner in my own halls until the Freys were killed and Lady Stark's daughter reclaimed Winterfell. But the Riverlands are weary of war. We've lost so many men over the years. We can't afford another slaughter." Jon respected the man's caution. He gestured for Edmure to walk with him along the edge of the camp, out of earshot of the main force. Ghost trailed at a respectful distance, watchful. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice your entire house again," Jon said, "but we need your help if we're to take King's Landing quickly. Cersei will not go quietly." Edmure pursed his lips. "You want my swords, then?" Jon exhaled. "We want your neutrality if not your active support. And if you can lend us men who are willing to fight for a better realm, we'd be grateful. I know the Riverlands have bled, but if Cersei remains, do you think she'll spare the Riverlands from taxes and raids? She'll keep you all on a knife's edge, just as her father did." Edmure gazed at the rows of soldiers readying tents, the war banners, the hulking shape of Drogon circling overhead. "My wife and son are in Riverrun. I won't risk them without cause. But if your queen is a just ruler, and you, her co-ruler or whatever the realm decides, then perhaps the Riverlands can see a better tomorrow." He paused, weighing the moment. "We don't have the numbers we once did, but I can pledge 3,000 men. Some are still healing, but they can march. I only ask that the new queen, and you, remember the Riverlands when you sit the throne." Jon extended a hand, relief mingling with caution. "Thank you. The realm must be healed, not punished. I promise you, your men will be under my protection." Edmure nodded and clasped Jon's forearm. "Then we have an understanding." They parted with an agreement that Edmure's contingent would meet them near Riverrun within a few days. Jon relayed the news to Daenerys that evening, finding her in her tent with Tyrion and Davos. Tyrion let out a satisfied sigh. "Excellent. The Tully name carries weight among the lesser lords. If Edmure's on our side, he can convince at least a few more to stay out of Cersei's orbit." Daenerys dipped her head. "Thank you, Jon. The more we can unify the realm without fire and blood, the better." Jon nodded, meeting her gaze. "We've had enough death. If we can end this war quickly, so much the better." They remained in the Riverlands for some days, mustering the Tully men. Edmure himself returned to Riverrun to prepare. As the joint forces gathered, scouts came back with uneasy reports. The Golden Company had begun fortifying positions closer to King's Landing, presumably under the direction of Cersei's new commander. Euron Greyjoy's Iron Fleet patrolled the waters off Crackclaw Point, sinking any ship suspected of carrying Targaryen sympathizers. Late one afternoon, Jon took a quiet ride across a low ridge to clear his head. He dismounted near a stream half-choked with ice. Ghost loped beside him. The sun was dipping behind the western hills, painting the sky in muted blues and oranges. Overhead, Drogon soared once again, a dark silhouette against the clouds. Jon couldn't help feeling a pang. Daenerys had once flown with 2 other dragons by her side. Now only Drogon remained, a testament to how much had been lost against the Night King. He glanced back at the distant sprawl of campfires dotting the landscape, men's voices drifting in muffled clamor. They were forging onward step by step. But each step took him further from Winterfell, from the memory of who he had been before learning his parentage. The weight of that truth still hung around his neck like a millstone. Sometimes he wished he could go back to being only Jon Snow, Ned Stark's bastard. Yet the realm now looked to him as the Targaryen who slew the Night King. And Daenerys needed him to quell any rumors that he might supplant her. In the thin twilight, he turned to see another rider approaching, Davos Seaworth, picking his way along the bank. The older man's beard was flecked with silver. He dismounted, boots crunching in the frosty grass. "Your Grace," Davos said softly, nodding. Jon pressed his lips into a thin line. "I wish you'd just call me Jon." Davos's expression was wry. "And I wish we were still on the walls of Castle Black, with no kings and queens to worry about. But we are where we are." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind ruffling their cloaks. Then Davos spoke, voice subdued. "A raven came in. Sansa writes that Winterfell is settling slowly, burying the dead. She and Arya keep the peace. She also mentions that some northern lords have been complaining that you're marching south for another Targaryen war. And they're uneasy about the possibility that once you help Daenerys take the Iron Throne, you'll remain in the south." Jon's jaw clenched. "I understand their fear. The North has always wanted to govern itself. They worry I'll become a southern king and forget them." Davos said, "It's not an easy fix. But Sansa suggests you might need to send them reassurance, formal reassurance, that the North will remain a priority. She even hints that if the realm must have a single monarch, the North might want certain autonomies guaranteed." Jon grimaced, remembering the centuries when the North had been its own kingdom. He didn't doubt Sansa was pressing for whatever advantage she could glean. "I'll talk to Daenerys. Maybe there's a way to reassure the North without fracturing everything." Davos stepped forward, gazing at the half-frozen stream. "The Queen is proud. She's lost so much. Don't let that push you into corners. You have a right to speak for the North, to protect it. That's who you are, whether Stark or Targaryen." Jon nodded slowly, feeling the swirling tension of 2 claims pulling at him. "I," was all he managed. They turned back to camp, the sky darkening overhead. Across the fields, the flicker of campfires grew brighter, mirrored in the shallow waters. Drogon roared in the distance, a reminder of what fueled their cause. By the time they left the riverlands behind, the host had grown to nearly 10,000 men. Unsullied northern knights, a sprinkling of Vale riders, Tully bowmen, and a smattering of volunteers who loathed Cersei. A fraction of what had once been possible before the wars, but still formidable, and they had a dragon. The road south was well trampled, winding through farmland left to winter's wrath. Daenerys, from atop Drogon, spotted no sign of the Lannister army in the open. Tyrion guessed that Cersei was gathering her forces near the capital, possibly fortifying key choke points. That suspicion was confirmed when outriders reported that the main roads to King's Landing were blocked by the Golden Company's detachments. The Sellswords had apparently installed pickets and barricades, forcing any approaching army to fight or find alternate routes. In a command tent pitched near a small stand of winterbear trees, Daenerys held council with her chief advisors. Jon stood at her right, Davos and Tyrion on her left, Grey Worm just behind them, arms folded. Tyrion used small carved markers on a rough map to indicate the known positions. They're holding the Rosby Road, the one that leads directly from the Crownlands into the city's northern gates. They've also likely reinforced the King's Gate itself. If we storm up that road, we'll be fighting a large portion of the Golden Company in prepared positions. We might succeed, but at a heavy cost. Jon frowned, eyeing the map. "Is there another way?" Davos cleared his throat. "We could approach from the west, crossing the Blackwater near the old ferry points. But the Lannisters might still have men at the Gold Road approaches. and that route leaves us open to any flanking from the sea if Euron Greyjoy sails upriver. Daenerys tapped a finger on the parchment. What if we split our forces? One column approaches from the Rosby Road to draw their main host, while another circles around to the west. Drogon and I can strike from above. Jon shared a glance with Davos. Splitting the army could be risky if we meet stiff resistance. But if done well, we can force Cersei to defend on two fronts. Tyrion, what do you think? Tyrion pursed his lips. It's a gamble. If we do it carefully, we might trap some of the Golden Company away from the city walls. They'll have to fight in open fields, where Drogon can be a deciding factor. But we must remain wary of Euron. He sank much of Daenerys' fleet before. He could do so again. Daenerys' expression hardened at the mention of Euron's name. She had lost some of her closest allies to his ambushes. Missandei believes that Yara Greyjoy still holds some of the Iron Islands in my name. If she can harass Euron from the west, he might be too preoccupied to launch a decisive attack on our flank. Tyrion nodded thoughtfully. We can send ravens to Yara, urging her to strike soon. That might relieve pressure on our approach to King's Landing. Jon straightened, scanning the map. All right, let's finalize a plan. We need to end this war quickly, with as little bloodshed as possible. The people in King's Landing, they've suffered under Cersei, but they don't deserve to die for her. Daenerys gave him a measured look. Agreed. We'll give them every chance to surrender. Grey Worm, ever direct, interjected. If the city doesn't surrender, do we use the dragon to break the walls? Jon saw the flicker of caution in Daenerys' eyes. She had used dragonfire before, but the memory of the devastation it caused, especially after losing Regal, likely still weighed on her. She nodded, but her voice was quiet. If we must, but I'd rather have them open the gates once their army is beaten. Thus, they decided on a two-pronged approach, sending word to Yara, though there was no guarantee she could coordinate with them in time. Over the next days, the alliance moved carefully across the Crownlands, skirting main roads, aiming to come upon King's Landing from angles less fortified. Daenerys often took to the skies on Drogon, scouting columns of men in the distance. Each time she rose, hundreds of eyes followed her, a mixture of awe and dread. Dragonfire had once shattered armies. It could do so again, but the sellswords of the Golden Company were no fools, and they likely had tactics of their own. Tension ran high in camp. The Northerners grumbled about the mild southern weather, about the unending war. The Riverlanders worried about leaving their homes exposed. Soldiers from Essos, the Unsullied, and the remaining Dothraki were foreigners in a land whose language and customs they found strange. Yet a singular purpose bound them: the vow to remove Cersei from power. Jon spent countless hours walking among the men, hearing their doubts, steadying them. Daenerys, too, made appearances, sometimes with Tyrion or Davos at her side, speaking of the greater good they fought for. Bit by bit, discipline held. One clear morning, riders returned with news. A vanguard of the Golden Company, some 2,000 men, had encamped near a small fortress called Heron's Watch, an outpost that once reported to Harrenhal. The fortress was little more than a stone ring wall and a gatehouse, but the company had made it their base to watch the roads. If Jon's army advanced, they would likely have to deal with that force. The leadership convened once more in a hastily erected command tent, a swirl of candles lighting the gloom. A cold wind seeped through the canvas. Daenerys, standing near the map table, asked Grey Worm, "Can we bypass Heron's Watch?" Grey Worm shook his head. "If we do, they'll harry our supply lines. We risk being attacked from behind." Tyrion nodded. "Then we deal with them here on this ground before we reach the city. Better to defeat them in the open than face them behind the capital's walls." Jon peered at the map. "We have more numbers, especially now that Edmure's men joined. If we corner the sellswords away from the fortress, we can press them to surrender or face dragonfire. They're sellswords. Many might lay down arms rather than be roasted alive." Daenerys' eyes flickered with a trace of steel. "A wise outcome, if possible. We'll give them that chance. But I won't risk our men in a drawn-out siege of a minor fortress." so they laid plans for a swift confrontation. The next day, the vanguard advanced. Daenerys took to the sky with Drogon, while Jon led a portion of the army in a wide flanking maneuver, hoping to drive the Golden Company out into the fields. Tyrion and Davos remained with the main force, ready to follow up the encirclement. At dawn, the clash began. Scouts had sighted the Sellswords forming a line between the fortress and a low ridge. As the Alliance forces approached, Jon could see the banners of the Golden Company snapping in the breeze, an elephant sigil. Though they had once famously fielded war elephants, they had none here, thanks to the difficulty of shipping them across the narrow sea. Still, they were well-trained veterans, wearing polished armor and armed with discipline. Jon halted his troops just out of arrow range. The Golden Company's commander, a tall man with short-cropped silver hair, rode forward, flanked by standard-bearers. Jon rode to meet him, accompanied by Grey Worm, a handful of Northern Knights, and a single Tully bannerman carrying a white flag of parley. They drew up, facing each other in the muddy field. The wind ruffled manes and cloaks, carrying the chill of the winter that lingered. Overhead, Drogon circled, casting a long shadow. The Sellswords' horses stamped nervously at the dragon's cry. The commander sized Jon up. "I am Captain General Eric Vaughn of the Golden Company," he said in the common tongue, accent lightly Essosi. "Whom do I address?" Jon's breath misted. "Jon Snow. I lead these men in alliance with Daenerys Targaryen, the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms. We ask you to yield and avoid needless bloodshed. Your cause is hopeless. You stand against a dragon and an army larger than your own." Captain Vaughn's expression was controlled. "We've been paid handsomely to serve Queen Cersei Lannister. Ours is not a cause of loyalty, but a contract. If you think your victory is guaranteed, you should know that we are well aware of how to fight dragons. We have scorpions and ballistae behind our lines, and more near the fortress. Our outriders have scouted your flanks." Jon tried not to let worry show on his face. Even so, he knew scorpions had brought down Regal once before, though that was with Euron's ships. "Your scorpions won't stop Drogon for long, and even if you kill the dragon, you'll face overwhelming numbers. No Sellsword contract is worth certain death." Vaughn's gaze flicked upward at the swirling shape of Drogon. "War's never certain. Cersei Lannister has deeper coffers than you might imagine. And there's something you should know, Jon Snow. Rumor says you are a Targaryen with the best claim to the throne. So which Targaryen are we meant to fear more, you or your queen? Perhaps you'll turn on each other." Jon kept his voice calm. "We stand united, no matter what rumors say." The Captain General let out a breath. "We shall see. We have our orders. If you're intent on pressing the fight, then you may start it, but will not lay down arms simply because you demand it." Jon felt a flash of anger. "So you choose death?" Vaughn's expression did not waver. "We choose to honor our contract, unless a better offer is made." Jon studied him. The Golden Company was famous for upholding their word, but they were still mercenaries at heart. He recalled how Daenerys had once tried to turn the Second Sons or the Sellswords in Essos. Sometimes money could speak louder than loyalty, but the Alliance's coffers were not bottomless, and Cersei had the Lannister gold. "I have no immediate goal to offer that rivals Cersei's," Jon said, "but we can offer a realm at peace, freedom from the chaos this war will unleash. Think carefully. Fighting for Cersei might cost you your entire company. Even if you win, she'll throw you aside. That's the Lannister way." The captain considered, then shook his head. "You miscalculate, Targaryen. The Golden Company is strong. We do not break contracts on a whim." Jon saw no point in further talk. "Very well," he said in a cold voice. "We gave you the chance. We don't want to slaughter men who fight for coin, but if you persist, so be it." They turned and rode back to their lines. The wind seemed sharper. Grey Worm's face was impassive, but Jon heard the tension in his clipped breath. "They won't yield." "No," Jon replied grimly. A horn sounded from the Golden Company's ranks. Their cavalry shifted, forming two wings, while their main infantry stood in disciplined lines behind wooden stakes hammered into the ground. Jon spurred his horse back to the Alliance formation, where Tully Bowman and the Northern Knights awaited. He raised his arm. "Archers, stand ready." A wave of movement rippled across the lines. Tully men knocked arrows. The Unsullied advanced on foot, spears gleaming, while Northern swordsmen formed ranks. Jon's heart pounded. He hated what was coming, but it was inevitable now. A shrill cry from above signaled Daenerys' arrival. Drogon swooped low, belching flame at the far side of the field, cutting off a flank. The Golden Company scattered, some diving for cover. A few scorpions swiveled on makeshift mounts, launching bolts that sliced the sky. Drogon banked sharply, avoiding them with a roar. At that, the Alliance's horns blew, and the charge began. Northern Knights thundered across the muddy ground toward the company's right flank. The Unsullied, with disciplined precision, advanced in a tight formation on the left. Grey Worm led them, eyes cold, spears bristling. Tyrion and Davos stood behind the main line, directing reserve units. Arrows arced overhead in black volleys, rattling against shields and armor. The Golden Company unleashed their own barrage, cutting down some of the Alliance's front rank. Yet the presence of Drogon overhead sowed chaos in their lines. Daenerys circled wide, unleashing jets of flame at intervals, forcing the Sellswords to break formation. Jon saw the Scorpions reorient, trying desperately to track the dragon's swift movements. Jon led a wedge of Northern cavalry, Longclaw strapped at his hip. The horses galloped into the Golden Company's flank, splintering lances on shields and knocking men aside. He heard the ring of steel, the screams of the dying. Mud and blood churned underhoof. Then, in the press of bodies, Jon drew Longclaw and fought on foot. The Sellswords were skilled, parrying with lethal speed, but the Northmen had grit and fury. More and more Alliance forces poured in, threatening to collapse the Golden Company's lines. On the left flank, Grey Worm's Unsullied battered into the pikes of the enemy, methodically breaking their formation. Dragonglass spears were of little advantage here. Steel against steel, man against man, but the Unsullied discipline held. They slid in tight phalanx style, pushing forward relentlessly. Even as some fell, the line advanced. A ballista bolt whistled overhead, aimed at Drogon. Daenerys veered the dragon sharply, the bolt missing by feet and slamming into the ground with a jarring thud. Drogon roared in anger, swooping over the Scorpion's position. His flames burst outward, incinerating the wooden machinery and the men operating it. Smoke billowed. Amid the tumult, Jon clashed with a large Sellsword whose shield bore the Golden Company's elephant. Their blades met with a jarring impact. The man's face contorted with effort, pressing forward. Jon sidestepped, hooking Longclaw under the man's sword to knock it aside, then slashed across his chest. The Sellsword staggered, blood spewing. Jon's breath came in ragged bursts. He whirled to parry another blow from behind. The battlefield became a chaotic swirl of metal, mud, and shouting. Arrows rained from both sides. Slowly, the Alliance's superior numbers and the presence of Drogon began to tell. Clusters of Golden Company soldiers held stubbornly, but Daenerys focused her dragon's fury on the Scorpions. Each time a new one fired, she raked it with flames. Captain General Vaughn, at the center, tried to rally his men, cursing them to hold. But the flanks were caving in. The Tully archers raked them from a distance, while the Northern cavalry hammered their lines. At last, seeing they were surrounded, some of the Golden Company began to throw down their arms. Shouts for quarter rang out. The Captain General bellowed for them to fight on, but it was too late. Discipline broke. Pockets of Sellswords tried to flee toward the fortress, only to find Drogon's towering shape blocking that path. Others surrendered on the spot, dropping swords in the slush. Jon forced his way through the throng toward the center, where Captain Vaughn still fought with a handful of loyal men. Grey Worm converged from the other side, spear lowered, face grim. The captain, seeing no escape, let out a despairing cry and threw his sword at Jon's feet. The half-dozen men with him followed suit. "It's done," Vaughn rasped, chest heaving. Blood seeped from a gash in his armor. "Finish it, then," Jon panted, Longclaw in hand, eyes flicking over the battered, mud-splattered sellsword. "We offered surrender," he said. "Will you accept it now?" Vaughn sank to his knees. "I'd sooner die than break a contract, but my men have chosen otherwise." He closed his eyes. "I yield." Jon gestu, red for the northern knights to seize him. Grey Worm watched impassively. Around them, the battlefield quieted as more and more sellswords dropped weapons, kneeling or raising empty hands. Bodies littered the muddy ground, steam rising from gore. A few small fires burned where Drogon's flame had ignited timbers. With the Golden Company's vanguard defeated, the fortress was effectively theirs. Some sellswords still manned the walls, but upon hearing the news, they too laid down arms rather than face the dragon. The entire engagement had been bloody but decisive, a swift victory that scattered or captured nearly 2,000 enemy mercenaries. The alliance sustained losses as well, especially among the cavalry that had led the charge, but the overall result was in their favor. Daenerys landed Drogon in the field, the dragon's sides heaving from exertion. Grey Worm organized the Unsullied to disarm the prisoners and collect their weapons. Jon dismounted from his horse, somehow still alive, and wiped mud and blood from his face. A swirl of acrid smoke clung to the scene. Davos and Tyrion approached, surveying the damage. "We've won," Davos said, though his tone was subdued. He glanced at the fallen. Another day of war. More dead men. Jon looked at the scattered enemy soldiers kneeling in the mire. Some wept, others stared blankly. He turned to Daenerys, who stepped closer, a hard gleam in her eyes. "What do we do with them?" she asked. "In Essos, we learned sometimes the best way to end conflict was to break the chain of violence. But if we let them go, Cersei might reclaim them." Tyrion stepped forward. "They may have families and old ties. For now, hold them as prisoners. Some might be convinced to swear loyalty to you, or at least remain neutral. Those who refuse, well, we can keep them imprisoned until the war ends. No sense in slaughtering them." Jon inclined his head. "Agreed. Let's not become what we fight against." Daenerys studied him. At last, she nodded. "Very well. See it done." She raised her voice so the nearest soldiers could hear. "We will grant quarter to those who have surrendered. They shall be disarmed and detained but treated with fairness, until this war is over." A ripple of relieved murmurs came from the captured sellswords. The Alliance troops, though many still full of battle fury, obeyed, corralling the prisoners under guard. Captain Vaughn was bound and led away, his face a grim mask. Through the day, they cleared the battlefield, treating the wounded as best they could. Pyres were built for the dead. The captured fortress, Heron's Watch, turned out to be a modest structure with a low outer wall, but it offered enough shelter to nurse the injured. Daenerys took counsel with Jon and Tyrion that evening in the stone-walled great hall of the fortress. The fires crackled, pushing back the chill. "It's only a fraction of Cersei's forces," Tyrion cautioned, arms folded. "The Golden Company we faced today was an advance guard. The main host likely awaits near King's Landing. And who knows how many scorpions Qyburn has built on the walls." Daenerys' face remained set in stern lines. "Then we press on, using the same strategy. Force them into open battle if we can, or break through their lines. With one difference. They'll be more prepared for Drogon next time." Jon nodded. "We'll need to stay vigilant. They'll try to hit the dragon from a distance. We can't afford to lose Drogon. If we do," he hesitated. The ramifications were too grim to state plainly. If Drogon fell, the advantage vanished. Daenerys took a slow breath. "I'll be careful. I promise you that." The days that followed saw the alliance sweeping further toward the capital, taking smaller outposts or bypassing them if they offered no resistance. Tyrion sent envoys to any local lords, urging them to stand down. Some complied. Others fled to King's Landing. Bit by bit, the net tightened around the city. Anxiety rose among the troops. The final confrontation loomed. Messages arrived sporadically by Raven. One from Sansa, urging caution and reminding Jon that the North stood behind him as long as he remembered who he was. Another from Yara Greyjoy, indicating that she had harried Euron's ships off the coast near the Shield Islands, forcing them to regroup. She could not promise they wouldn't slip away to return to King's Landing, but she had done her best. At last, scouts reported that the main body of the Golden Company, supported by remnants of the Lannister forces, was entrenching outside King's Landing, blocking the Rosby and Gold Road approaches. Cersei was apparently stationing scorpions atop the city walls, near the gates, and around the harbor. The rumored caches of wildfire were unconfirmed, but Tyrion feared Qyburn might have more devilry in store. Jon and Daenerys halted the Alliance host in a broad plain about a league from the city. A gentle hill rose on one side, offering a vantage of the thick, sloping walls of King's Landing. From that hill, one could see the Red Keep rising over the sprawl of buildings and rooftops. The gilded domes and towers glimmered in the midday sun. Far off, the mouth of the Blackwater Rush reflected silver. Columns of smoke rose from the city's chimneys, overshadowed by the looming presence of an army beyond its gates. The Alliance made camp in a ring formation, prepared for a possible sudden assault. Patrols were sent out. At twilight, fires dotted the field. Jon walked among the tents, hearing men mutter about the rumored scorpions that could pierce Dragonhide, or the possibility that the entire city was rigged with wildfire. Anxiety gnawed at everyone. After all they had endured, hard home, the Battle of the Bastards, the long night, this final conflict with living men felt monstrous in its own way. As darkness settled, Jon slipped away from the bustle, making his way to a rise of ground where the torchlight of the camp gave way to quiet starlight. There, he found Daenerys standing alone, a thick cloak around her shoulders, silver hair stirring in the breeze. Drogon was perched on a low rocky outcrop nearby, his massive head resting on folded claws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Jon approached softly, mindful not to startle the dragon. "It'll be a long night," he said, voice low. Daenerys turned her head slightly. "Every night is long now," she murmured, a faint tremor in her tone. "I keep thinking about my father, how he wanted to burn this city, and how I must not become that." Jon's chest tightened with empathy. "You won't. You're not the Mad King." She shook her head. "Sometimes I wonder if that madness is in my blood too. I felt so much rage at Cersei, for all she's done. The deaths of my dragons, my friends. I fear I could lose control, but I won't let myself become a tyrant. I swore to break the wheel, not crush the realm under it." Jon gently touched her uninjured arm. "We stand with you. You have people who believe in you, who'll keep you from going too far. Tyrion, Davos, and me, and you've seen what war does. You wouldn't burn thousands of innocents for one woman's crimes." She closed her eyes, nodding. "I'd like to believe that." A longer silence followed, the two of them gazing toward the faint glow of King's Landing's lights in the distance. Drogon shifted restlessly, wings rustling. Finally, Daenerys inhaled. "Tomorrow or the day after, we'll try to parley again. Give Cersei the chance to surrender. She won't take it, but we must offer. For the people's sake." Her gaze flicked to Jon. "If you stand beside me in that moment, it'll show our unity clearly. I need the realm to see that the Targaryens stand together, not against each other." Jon's heart twisted. His entire life he had been taught to see Targaryens as distant, dangerous, and nearly extinct. Now he was one. Despite all the swirling complexities of blood and name, he nodded. "I'll be there." She released a soft sigh, as if relieved. "Thank you, Jon." She turned away then, cloak billowing behind her, and returned to Drogon's side. The dragon rumbled deep in his throat, exhaling a hot gust that ruffled Daenerys' hair. Jon stood for a moment longer, watching them, a queen and her dragon, poised on the brink of a final war. On a brisk morning 2 days later, the Alliance marched to within sight of the city's main gates. The Rosby Road was lined with earthen ramparts hastily erected by the Lannisters and the Golden Company. A forest of scorpions bristled behind those ramparts. The air tasted of tension. From the distance, King's Landing spread out, Huge and sprawling, its gates shut tight. Hundreds of archers manned the battlements. Red and gold Lannister banners drooped in the stillness. A hush settled over the field when Daenerys, astride Drogon, soared closer. She did not unleash flame, only hovered menacingly above, as if to emphasize the futility of resistance. At the same time, Jon advanced with a small retinue, Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, and a half-dozen Northmen bearing a white banner. They halted out of crossbow range, though every man on both sides tensed at the possibility of treachery. Over the enemy lines, a gilded platform had been erected behind the ramparts, flanked by a row of Golden Company soldiers. On that platform stood Cersei Lannister herself, robed in black and crimson, golden crown gleaming in the morning sun. Qyburn hovered at her side, face pale and unreadable. A small cluster of red-cloaked Queensguard waited, each armed with a tall spear. Behind them, more scorpions aimed upward, tracking Drogon's movements. Jon's chest felt tight as he dismounted. He could see Cersei's face at a distance. Porcelain features, cold eyes. She had once refused them help against the dead, had tried to outwit them, broken every vow. Now she stood on the walls of her capital with cunning malice. He glanced up to see Daenerys on Drogon, a silhouette against the sky. Tyrion stepped forward, calling out loudly, "Queen Cersei, we have come to parley. Will you speak with us?" Cersei lifted a hand. The Golden Company soldiers parted slightly, allowing Qyburn to descend from the platform. The gaunt-faced man approached with deliberate steps, halting a dozen yards from Jon and Tyrion. Qyburn inclined his head. "My queen sends her regards. She wonders what terms you wish to offer." Tyrion set his jaw. "We offer an end to bloodshed. Surrender the throne to its rightful claimant, Daenerys Targaryen, and no harm will come to the people of King's Landing. The city's gates will remain intact, and your queen will be allowed to leave. She may take a small retinue and go into exile across the narrow sea. This is the mercy we extend." Qyburn's thin lips curved into a ghost of a smile. "Mercy, indeed. And what if my queen refuses such a generous offer?" Jon spoke then, trying to keep his voice steady. "Then the city will suffer a siege. Thousands could die. Queen Cersei knows her scorpions won't stop Drogon forever. More of your Golden Company might choose to surrender as well." His breath plumed in the chilly air. "Better to lay down arms and spare the innocent." Qyburn studied Jon, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You speak of innocence, yet you stand beside a dragon. We all know what dragons do to cities. My queen remains unconvinced. She believes your queen's wrath might be unstoppable once she sits on that throne." Tyrion's knuckles whitened. "We don't want to burn the city. That is why we're here, offering a chance. Spare yourself the ruin. Give the throne to Daenerys." High on the platform, Cersei watched impassively, flanked by archers. Qyburn glanced up at her, then back at Jon and Tyrion. "My queen rejects your terms. She says you have no right to claim the Iron Throne, Targaryen or otherwise. The throne belongs to her by victory, by marriage, by law. She suggests you withdraw and leave Westeros to its rightful ruler." Jon felt his temper flare. "Your rightful ruler is a liar who deserted the living in their war against the dead, who broke every vow." Qyburn raised a hand, unruffled. "You're out of time for insults, I fear." Tyrion tried a final appeal. "Cersei, if you can hear me, think of your child." He called past Qyburn, voice echoing across the silent field. "If you want the Lannister name to live on, if you want your city to survive, surrender now. Ring the bells, open the gates. We've both lost so much. Do not make the people suffer for your pride." Cersei's expression remained unmoved, but her eyes flicked to Tyrion with a certain venom. She turned away, raising a hand in a dismissive gesture. Qyburn bowed stiffly to Jon and Tyrion. "You have your answer. My queen does not yield." With that, Qyburn retreated, ascending the platform once more. One of the Golden Company's soldiers blew a horn, and the scorpions pivoted, men shifting anxiously. Jon and Tyrion backed away carefully. Grey Worm and the others followed, muscles taut. Overhead, Drogon roared, as if warning the scorpions not to fire. Back in their lines, Tyrion exhaled shakily. She'll let her city burn before she surrenders. Gods damn her. Jon felt a bleak certainty settle in his gut. Then we have no choice but to lay siege. We can't just charge the walls. We must be strategic. Take out the scorpions, open a path to the gates. Daenerys flew Drogon down near the Alliance's front lines, dismounting in a swirl of dust. She refused? She asked, though her tone implied she already knew. Tyrion inclined his head grimly. She refused. We have to proceed. Daenerys's gaze flicked to the city, anger simmering. So be it. We'll give the people time to flee, if they wish. But once we attack, we can't hold back for fear of scorpions on every rampart. I will not lose Drogon. I'll burn those war machines before they can kill him. Jon stepped nearer, laying a hand on her arm. We do this carefully. We keep the gates in sight. The moment they ring the bells, we stop. We let them surrender. Tyrion says the bells are the sign that the city yields. Yes. Tyrion nodded, fervent. If you hear bells, it means the city has given up the fight. My sister might not ring them, but the people might, if they see no hope. If that happens, we must stop, or else the city truly will be lost. Daenerys fixed Tyrion with a level stare. Understood. Her eyes then moved to Jon, her expression torn between resolve and dread. Let's hope they choose life over pride. Thus began the final lead-up to the siege. Daenerys withdrew the army slightly, out of immediate crossbow range, and allowed the Gates of Kings landing a day for civilians to flee if they dared. Some took the chance, streaming out into the fields, but many remained behind, out of fear or loyalty or inability to leave. The next morning, the Alliance prepared for the assault, arraying themselves along the roads that encircled the city's walls. Jon took command of a large contingent of Northmen and Tully archers, assigned to assault the North Gate if possible, while Daenerys would strike from the air, focusing on destroying scorpions. Grey Worm and the Unsullied prepared to breach the main gate once the defenses were weakened. Tyrion and Davos coordinated the various flanking maneuvers, ensuring the Golden Company could not slip out and strike from behind. The sun rose blood-red over the city, reflecting on the spires of the Red Keep. The tension was palpable as the Alliance advanced. This was the heart of the Seven Kingdoms. To seize it was to seize power entire. But at what cost? A horn note echoed. From the city walls, crossbowmen loosed the first bolts. The siege had begun. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, scanning for the nearest scorpions. She spotted a row of them perched behind merlins on the battlements. The operators raised their weapons, aiming at the oncoming dragon. Daenerys wasted no time. She dived, weaving side to side to spoil their aim, then unleashed a blast of flame that incinerated two scorpions in a roar of splintering wood. The defenders scattered, screaming. Far below, the Alliance infantry pressed forward under a hail of arrows. Some men fell, but they kept advancing, shields raised. Jon led a charge toward the North Gate, archers returning fire at the ramparts. The Golden Company's banners were visible, but fewer in number than expected. Perhaps the defeat at Heron's Watch had forced them to consolidate. A scorpion bolt whizzed past Drogon's flank. Daenerys veered, heart hammering. Another soared by, narrowly missing the dragon's wing. She guided Drogon in a plunging arc, exhaling a torrent of fire on a line of Lannister archers. The city wall blackened, stones cracking with the heat. Then she pulled up before hitting the towers. On the field, the Unsullied advanced under Grey Worm's command, forming a disciplined front. With heavy rams, they battered the main gate. Lannister soldiers behind the portcullis jabbed at them with spears, but the Unsullied's shields deflected many blows. Flames flickered overhead from stray arrows. Jon fought near the North Gate, slashing at a group of Lannister men-at-arms who sallied out in a desperate attempt to drive back the attackers. Ghost was not at his side. Jon had left the direwolf behind the lines, not wishing to risk him in the chaos. Steel rang on steel, men cried out, but the Northmen slowly gained ground. Tully archers peppered the walls, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down. Above it all, the city's bells remained silent. Daenerys methodically targeted each scorpion she could spot. Qyburn must have stationed dozens of them. Some the defenders fired prematurely, missing by wide margins. Others came close. Twice, Drogon roared in fury as a bolt grazed his scales. Fear clenched Daenerys's heart each time, but she pressed on, burning scaffolds and war machines in black plumes of smoke. She saw small pockets of Lannister soldiers routing from the walls, the unstoppable terror of dragonfire too much to bear. Below, the main gate shuddered under the pounding of the battering ram. Suddenly, with a splintering crash, it broke. Grey Worm and his Unsullied poured in, spears raised. The Lannister defenders wavered, pinned between the invaders and the threat of dragonfire overhead. A few tried to stand their ground. Others threw down weapons. Grey Worm pressed forward, stoic and deadly, carving a path into the city's streets. Meanwhile, Jon's group succeeded in wresting control of the North Gatehouse. He stood, panting, amid the wreckage, battered shield on his arm. The Lannisters here had broken quickly once the archers lost their vantage. Some surrendered outright. Only a few pockets of fierce resistance remained. Smoke drifted over the rooftops. The acrid smell of burning pitch saturated the air. Jon signaled to his men, "Secure the gate, let the rest of our forces in. No killing of prisoners." The Northmen nodded, some with relief, others grudging. They swung the gates open. More Alliance soldiers surged forward, flooding into the outer district. From a vantage near the gatehouse tower, Jon could see across the city rooftops, where columns of smoke rose. Even amid the chaos, the bells did not ring. The idea that the small folk might ring them if they had hope. Maybe it was too much to ask. Or maybe Cersei had ordered every bell tower barred. On the main thoroughfare, Grey Worm's Unsullied marched deeper, engaging pockets of Lannister soldiers and Golden Company mercenaries. Tyrion had joined the infiltration, though Davos cautioned him to stay back. Tyrion needed to see if the city would break, if any bells would toll. So far, only the sounds of battle filled the air. Daenerys soared overhead, scanning the rooftops. Then she saw a flicker of green near the Red Keep, a swirl of unnatural smoke. Wildfire. A small explosion burst near a cluster of Alliance soldiers, sending them flying. Qyburn must have prepared hidden caches to sabotage them. Daenerys cursed and guided Drogon away from a second burst. If the city was rigged with wildfire in random pockets, the danger was enormous. She spotted the tall spire of the Great September's ruins, destroyed years ago by Cersei in another wildfire explosion, and beyond that, the Red Keep loomed. She turned Drogon toward the keep. If she could show the people that the castle might soon fall, perhaps the city would surrender. Flames licked along a row of houses where she had burned a scorpion nest. Civilians poured into the streets, shouting and fleeing. Suddenly, Daenerys glimpsed Euron Greyjoy's fleet in Blackwater Bay, launching bolts from scorpions mounted on deck. She swore under her breath. Yara had harried him, but apparently he'd still made it back. Another bolt zipped by, forcing her to wheel away from the harbor. A swirl of frustration built in her chest. So many threats, so many scorpions. Down below, inside the city walls, Jon's forces advanced. Grey Worm's Unsullied overcame a final line of defenders near the central market. Then, in a defining moment, a group of Lannister soldiers threw down shields en masse, clearly terrified, dropping swords with raised hands. The Unsullied paused, uncertain, awaiting Grey Worm's command. Some in the ranks clamored for revenge for all the betrayal and death House Lannister had caused. But Jon had spoken of mercy, and many had died to see that vow honored. Jon arrived, pushing through the throng, breath ragged. He saw the Lannister men cowering. Most had no fight left. He turned to Grey Worm, shaking his head. "They're done," Jon said. "We've won. No more killing." Grey Worm's face was a rigid mask, eyes flicking from the cowering soldiers to the black smoke overhead. He remembered the unspeakable losses the Lannisters had inflicted. Yet Jon's posture was firm, and these men were clearly surrendering. With visible effort, Grey Worm nodded once. The Unsullied lowered spears. A hush fell in that district, broken only by distant screams and crackling fire. Then, faint but unmistakable, across the city somewhere to the south, a bell began to toll. Once, twice, more joined in. The bells rang out in a cacophony. The people or someone within the city had found a way to signal surrender. Jon closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. Tyrion, who stood nearby, exhaled like a man freed from strangulation. Daenerys, circling overhead, heard the bells as well. Peeling through the smoky air, a wave of conflicting emotions swept her features. Victory, frustration, sorrow for all that had been lost, relief that further bloodshed might be spared. All across King's Landing, soldiers paused. Some Lannisters dropped to their knees, uncertain. Alliance troops, panting and bloodied, looked to their commanders for instructions. In the sky, Drogon hovered near the Red Keep, smoke swirling around him. For a moment, it seemed the city would be spared a final cataclysm. Daenerys guided Drogon downward, landing on a broad stretch of rubble near the keep's outer walls. She dismounted, footfalls echoing on scorched stones. The bells continued to ring, an uneven chorus. Civilians cowered in doorways, uncertain if the dragon might unleash another wave of destruction. Then the Red Keep's gates groaned open. A handful of Queensguard emerged, pale-faced, leading none other than Qyburn, who carried a white flag with trembling hands. Behind him, a few survivors of the Golden Company and Lannister officers stood in tense formation. Cersei was nowhere to be seen. Qyburn stepped forward, kneeling in the scorched courtyard. We yield to Queen Daenerys Stormborn," he said, voice shaking. "The city surrenders. We beg for mercy." Daenerys's breath came quickly. She had dreamed of taking the city, punishing Cersei. Now, at the brink of the Red Keep, the surrender was offered by Qyburn, not the queen herself. Her eyes narrowed. "Where is Cersei?" Qyburn licked his lips. She remains within, resisting the truth even as the bells toll. She refuses to come forth. She says if you want her, come take her. Daenerys's fists clenched. If she's left her people to die while she cowers in the keep, that is her choice. But the city is ours. Qyburn bowed his head. "Yes, your grace. I only ask that you spare those who no longer fight." Daenerys gazed at him a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "Stay here. If your men or your queen do anything to harm the people further, we will respond in kind." Meanwhile, in the city streets, Jon felt the shift. Soldiers stood down, Lannisters cast aside their weapons. Civilians emerged cautiously, some weeping with relief. The bells of surrender continued to ring. Jon signaled the men to hold their positions, to keep watch but refrain from violence. Grey Worms Unsullied fanned out to secure sections of the city, ensuring no pockets of resistance lingered. Word spread like wildfire. The city had surrendered. The Targaryen queen had taken King's Landing without fully razing it to the ground. Relief and confusion mingled in every street and alley. The clamor of the bells drowned out all else. Some of the people called out thanks to the Dragon Queen, while others cowered, remembering all the tales of Targaryen devastation. But for the moment, slaughter had ceased. Daenerys, flanked by a small retinue of Unsullied, advanced to the doors of the Red Keep. Behind her trailed Tyrion and Davos, each wide-eyed at the sudden shift in fortune. In the courtyard, they paused. Daenerys looked up at the towering fortress that once housed the Iron Throne, the seat of power she had sought her entire life. Smoke drifted across the sky. Drogon perched on a fallen battlement, letting out a low rumble. Then, from within the keep's open doors, footsteps echoed. The Queensguard parted, revealing Jaime Lannister, limping and pale, but upright. He locked eyes with Tyrion first, then with Daenerys. "I tried to convince her to leave," Jaime said, voice raw. "She wouldn't listen. She's beyond reason. She stands in the throne room, waiting." Daenerys studied him, The man had once pushed Bran Stark from a window, had fought to protect his family's crimes. And yet he had also fought for the living at Winterfell. She tightened her jaw. If she won't listen, then it ends now. Tyrion, stay here if you wish, or come with me, but Cersei will answer for her reign. Tyrion's face contorted with sorrow. She's my sister, but I know what she's done. If she insists on this end, then so be it. He nodded grimly, stepping beside Daenerys. Jaime turned to Jon, who arrived moments later with more northern soldiers. Jon Snow, Jaime said quietly, I remember you from Winterfell. Let me speak with her if there's any chance. Daenerys cut him off. I'll speak with her in the throne room. If she insists on fighting, there's nothing left to say. Jon approached, breathing hard from the rush across the city. We should be careful. Qyburn might have traps. Or she could have hidden wildfire. Davos, behind him, concurred. We saw smaller explosions earlier. Could be more waiting. Daenerys's gaze moved around the courtyard. We'll go slowly. Jaime Lannister can lead the way. If there's any sign of a trap, we pull back. Drogon will watch from above. So they entered the Red Keep, walking through halls that once bustled with courtiers. Now they were nearly empty, scattered with debris. The footfalls of the small group echoed. Daenerys, Jon, Tyrion, Jaime, Davos, Grey Worm, and a dozen Unsullied. They ascended staircases blackened by war. Occasionally, they passed cowering servants or guards who laid down swords, offering no resistance. At last, they reached the throne room. The massive doors stood ajar. Light streamed in through shattered stained glass windows, illuminating the Iron Throne at the far end, a jagged mass of swords hammered together centuries ago by Aegon the Conqueror. Nearby stood Cersei Lannister, alone, clad in black. Her golden crown rested atop disheveled hair, her expression cold and haunted. She did not flee or tremble. Instead, Cersei regarded them with a mixture of fury and despair. So it ends, she said, voice echoing. Daenerys stepped forward, cloak trailing on the cracked marble. Grey Worm and the Unsullied fanned out, forming a semicircle behind her. Jon stood to one side, hand on Longclaw, eyes watchful. Tyrion and Jaime hung back, tension visible in every line of their bodies. Davos lingered near the doorway, scanning for any sign of a hidden threat. Your city has surrendered, Daenerys said, voice resonant. Your soldiers have laid down arms. It's over, Cersei. Cersei lifted her chin. I've not surrendered. My people are fools to ring those bells. I am the rightful queen. Her voice wavered. Did you come to kill me, Daenerys Stormborn? To stand on the ashes of what was mine? Daenerys's eyes flicked to the Iron Throne, that cruel seat that had haunted her dreams. I came to spare this city. You gave me no choice. Stand down now, and perhaps you'll live. Cersei barked a harsh laugh. Live? As your prisoner, paraded through the streets. She glanced at Jaime, who stood stricken near the pillar. Brother, is this what you wanted? Jaime's voice was hoarse. I wanted you to leave, Cersei. This is madness. She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. Madness, perhaps. All I wanted was to protect my children. They're gone now. I have nothing left. Daenerys advanced another step. Jon tensed, prepared for any sudden move. Cersei's hand drifted to a dagger at her hip, but she did not draw it. Something akin to resignation showed in her face. She turned her gaze on Daenerys. Go on, take your throne. Burn me alive if you wish. Become your father's daughter. Daenerys's hand curled into a fist. The memory of her father's madness twisted in her mind. She took a shaking breath. No, I will not. I'm not my father. She looked at Grey Worm, then at Jon. Arrest her. She will stand trial for her crimes before the realm. Grey Worm and two Unsullied stepped forward. Cersei did not resist as they seized her arms, though her body trembled. She stared hatefully at Daenerys. Trial, you think you're so merciful. The realm is a rotting carcass. You'll see what it costs to wear that crown, Targaryen. Daenerys's expression hardened. Take her away, she ordered. The Unsullied led Cersei out, her footsteps echoing. Jaime moved to follow, but paused, exchanging a stricken look with Tyrion. Then he hurried after his sister, his face etched with sorrow. In the throne room's stillness, Daenerys turned to face the Iron Throne. The seat of power loomed in the shaft of broken daylight. For a long moment no one spoke. Tyrion swallowed, tears glinting in his eyes for reasons of his own. Perhaps relief that the city still stood, or heartbreak for the ruin of his family. Davos exhaled heavily, leaning on a pillar. Jon stepped closer to Daenerys. Her gaze was fixed on the throne, that impossible symbol she had chased halfway across the world. She had lost 2 dragons, beloved friends, unspeakable horrors in the process. Now it was within her grasp. She reached out, fingers brushing the hilt of a twisted sword in the throne's side. The metal was cold and unwelcoming. Her shoulders trembled. "I've wanted this for so long," she murmured, voice barely audible to Jon. "And now, after all the blood and fire, it feels empty." Jon laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You won, Daenerys. You saved thousands of innocent lives by stopping the slaughter. Your father would have burned them all. You are not him." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I know, and yet, I fear what lies ahead. Ruling is not the same as conquering. The realm will question me, some will hate me. They'll question you, question us." She turned to him, voice low. "Can we hold it together, Jon?" He met her gaze, thinking of the North, of all the uncertain alliances. "We must try," he said. "We must unite the realm, or we'll have all this bloodshed again." She took his hand. In that broken throne room, choked with dust and echoes of old ghosts, they shared a moment of quiet resolution. Victory might be theirs, but the true challenge, governing, loomed. Tyrion cleared his throat, stepping forward carefully, mindful of the tension. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the city is yours. All of Westeros will soon know that Daenerys Targaryen rules from the Iron Throne. We should confirm your coronation. We'll have to gather the lords, arrange some semblance of order, and decide what to do about the North and the rest of the 7 kingdoms." Daenerys closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. She turned to Davos. "Send word. The city is not to be sacked. Anyone committing atrocities will be punished. Post watchers at every gate. We keep the peace." Davos dipped his head. "Yes, Your Grace." Jon gently released Daenerys's hand. He heard the bells still tolling, though fainter now, as if uncertain whether the city was truly safe. "I'll spread the word among the northern men. No looting, no revenge." Daenerys brushed a tear from her cheek. "Thank you." As they left the throne room, the weight of the Iron Throne remained behind them. The path to uniting Westeros would be fraught with perils. Cersei still lived, as did Euron Greyjoy, and the scars of war ran deep. But Daenerys Targaryen had taken King's Landing without turning it to ash. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, had stood by her side, staying true to the honor that Ned Stark had taught him. The city was battered, not destroyed. In the charred corridors of the Red Keep, a new chapter would begin. Outside, in the streets, men knelt or bowed as Daenerys emerged. Some simply stared. The bells at last fell silent, replaced by the uncertain hush of relief, fear, and hope. Drogon roared overhead, a final exclamation. The new queen and her allies had come. The last war, for now, was over. In the days that followed, King's Landing bore the brunt of the aftermath. Corpses were cleared, wounded tended, fires doused. Alliance soldiers patrolled under strict orders to keep the peace. The city's people, weary and wary, saw the red dragon sigil draped over the gates. In the great September Sold Plaza, Daenerys gave a measured speech, promising a new era. No more tyranny, no more reckless cruelty like the Mad King or Cersei Lannister. Tyrion, standing nearby, watched the crowd's faces. Some glowered, others brightened with cautious optimism. Jon worked tirelessly to ensure his men upheld discipline, punishing any who committed acts of looting or brutality. News reached them that Euron Greyjoy, upon hearing of the surrender, had fled with part of his fleet, presumably seeking to regroup or vanish. Yara and her Ironborn loyal to Daenerys continued to chase him on the seas. Meanwhile, Cersei Lannister languished in a cell beneath the Red Keep, awaiting judgment. Jaime spent hours trying to reach her, but she rebuffed him in bitterness, blaming him for failing to save her rule. Councils convened daily in the Red Keep's audience chambers. Daenerys, Tyrion, Jon, Davos, Grey Worm. They discussed the immediate reorganization of the realm. Tyrion suggested that all the great lords be summoned to King's Landing for a formal coronation. Daenerys agreed, though her expression grew tense whenever the subject turned to the north. She knew the Northerners might resist any new monarchy that bound them to Southern rule. Jon, for his part, pressed for certain autonomies that Sansa had written about. "The North has always been different," he told Daenerys quietly one evening in a refurbished council room. "Perhaps we can formalize that difference. Let the North remain part of the realm, but with the right to select its own warden, manage its own laws. If you deny them that, you risk rebellion." Daenerys studied him, remembering their initial friction when she demanded the North bend the knee. "Very well," she said at last, with a heavy sigh. "If it keeps the realm united, I'll grant the North certain rights, provided they acknowledge my rule. I won't see the kingdom splintered into multiple independent states. Not after all we've fought for." Jon nodded, relieved. "That's all we ask." Word soon reached Winterfell and beyond, spreading that King's Landing had fallen, that Cersei was captured, that Daenerys Targaryen claimed the throne with Jon Snow's support. The realm stirred with a mixture of celebration and anxiety. Some lords were eager to see the end of Lannister rule. Others feared Targaryen dragons. But one truth was undeniable. The dead were gone, the city was conquered, and a new power reigned. Daenerys did not yet sit on the Iron Throne for official audiences, preferring to hold them in a less symbolic chamber. "I'll sit on it when the lords arrive and offer their fealty," she said. "Let the realm witness a formal coronation. Until then, I remain a conqueror, not fully crowned." Tyrion helped orchestrate invitations, ravens flying across the war-torn land. He wrote to the Tullys, the Arryns, the Starks, the Baratheon in Storm's End, Gendry Baratheon newly legitimized, and scattered other houses. Some might resent the new queen, but Tyrion insisted they come see for themselves. As the city stabilized, Daenerys and Jon walked the streets, accompanied by guards but trying to show their faces, to reassure the people that their new rulers were not tyrants. They saw charred walls, refugees huddled in corners, and the remains of the scorpions that once threatened Drogon. Jon's heart ached at the sight, though he knew it could have been far worse had the surrender not come. Daenerys spoke with a mother who had lost her husband in the fighting. The queen offered coin, supplies, and the promise of rebuilding. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. Meanwhile, trials began. The city demanded some measure of justice for those who had committed atrocities. Many Lannister officers swore to keep the peace under Daenerys' rule, preferring life to pointless resistance. The Golden Company, now leaderless and half-destroyed, had no appetite for rebellion. Some took service with the new queen, others accepted an offer to return to Essos under safe conduct. Captain Vaughn, captured at Heron's watch, had died from wounds before he could stand trial. As for Cersei, Tyrion urged caution. She was queen, and she surrendered, however unwillingly. If you kill her without a formal process, you risk the realm seeing it as vengeance. Daenerys nodded, though tension lined her face. "Then we shall have a formal process. The realm can judge her crimes." She glanced at Jon. "Will the North cry out if I execute her?" Jon's voice was careful. "Many want her dead. Others think her death changes nothing. But so long as it's seen as fair, so long as the realm knows her guilt, I doubt many tears will be shed." And so, days later, a gathering took place in a large courtyard of the Red Keep, with lords and knights from across the realm who had arrived in haste. The battered city was a swirl of new arrivals, each responding to Daenerys' summons. Edmure Tully came, representing the Riverlands. Robin Arryn, now a young man, arrived from the Vale with a small retinue, uncertain and uncomfortable. Lord Gendry Baratheon, newly recognized as the Lord of Storm's End, attended with a handful of knights. Yara Greyjoy came ashore after chasing off Euron, though she had not caught him. She offered Daenerys a stoic bow, reaffirming her fealty. Even Samwell Tarly arrived from the north with Gilly and Little Sam in tow, representing the Seta. Dell's attempt to restore knowledge. Sansa and Arya had not yet come south. Sansa focused on securing Winterfell, though she sent a letter acknowledging the new order. Arya had gone west on some mission of her own, with no word on when she might return. In that courtyard, beneath a leaden sky, Cersei Lannister was brought forth in chains, her black gown tattered, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Daenerys sat on a raised seat, not the Iron Throne, but a simpler throne set outdoors for the hearing. Tyrion and Davos flanked her. Jon stood behind Daenerys with Grey Worm. The assembled lords watched in hushed tension. A herald read out a litany of crimes: the destruction of the Great September with wildfire, the betrayal of the North in the Long Night, the murder of countless innocents. Evidence was presented. Tyrion himself offered a grim testimony of how Cersei had broken faith, manipulated the realm, and put them all at risk. Jaime was absent; he could not bear to watch. Cersei spoke little in her defense, only sneering at her accusers. When asked if she repented, she scoffed. Repent for what? Playing the Game of Thrones better than all of you until now. She scanned the crowd with undisguised contempt. You name me a monster, but you forget how many you've all killed. This realm is built on blood. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some were outraged, others frightened. Daenerys rose, voice carrying across the courtyard. Cersei of House Lannister, you stand condemned by the realm for your crimes. Have you anything else to say? Cersei lifted her chin, glare unwavering. Do what you will, Targaryen. You've taken everything. My children are dead. My father's legacy is dust. I have nothing left. Daenerys's expression was set. She turned to the assembled. The sentence is death. Silence followed, thick as storm clouds. Daenerys looked at Cersei with no triumph, only grim finality. May the gods have mercy on your soul, if they can. Cersei smirked, then closed her eyes. The unsullied guards seized her arms, forcing her to kneel. Daenerys considered for a moment, then gave a single nod to Grey Worm. Make it swift. Grey Worm stepped forward with a drawn sword, but Jon touched his shoulder gently. Let me, Jon said quietly. The courtyard stilled. Jon recalled all the bloodshed caused by House Lannister. He also recalled Ned Stark's teaching: the one who passes the sentence should swing the sword. While Daenerys was the queen, he felt the old northern tradition call to him. Grey Worm glanced at Daenerys. She nodded, deferring to Jon. So Jon stepped in front of Cersei, gripping Longclaw. She met his eyes with a faint sneer. Perhaps she expected him to quaver. He did not. He'd seen too much. For a heartbeat, he recalled that she was the mother of a king once. Then he pushed the thought aside. The realm demanded justice. He swung Longclaw in one clean arc. Cersei Lannister's head fell to the paving stones. A collective gasp shuddered through the crowd. Blood pooled. The courtyard was silent but for the flutter of cloaks in the breeze. Thus ended the reign of Cersei Lannister, final scion of a golden dynasty that had cast a long shadow over Westeros. Daenerys closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Tyrion looked away, tears in his eyes. Davos bowed his head. Some among the crowd murmured half-hearted cheers, but it was a somber moment overall. Vengeance might be done, but at a cost no one could measure. When Daenerys spoke again, her voice carried the weight of finality. The war is done. Let all houses know we begin anew. I will be crowned on the Iron Throne, and I ask for your fealty to build a better realm, one that does not thrive on cruelty and betrayal. Are you with me? In the hush, Edmure Tully knelt, pledging his loyalty. Robin Arryn followed, uncertain. Gendry Baratheon dropped to one knee, forging a new bond. Yara Greyjoy offered a stiff bow, reaffirming her support. One by one, the lesser lords present followed suit. Daenerys's jaw trembled as she recognized the enormity of it all. the fulfillment of a destiny shaped by years of exile and hardship. Jon watched, standing behind her. A swirl of conflicting emotions filled him. Relief that the war had ended, sorrow for all the dead, uncertainty about what the future held. Daenerys turned to him, meeting his gaze. Without words, he saw the question in her eyes. Would he, the man who shared her bloodline and once was named a king, stand by her side as she shaped the realm? Jon dipped his head in a small but clear gesture. He had never wanted the throne. He had only wanted peace, an end to the nightmares that had plagued Westeros for too long. As Daenerys' gaze softened, he knew that, for all their differences and the complexities of Targaryen heritage, he would do his utmost to help her rule justly. That evening, fires burned in braziers across King's Landing. The body of Cersei Lannister was taken to be entombed in what remained of the royal crypts. Jaime vanished from the city soon afterward, grief-stricken, refusing any honors. Tyrion withdrew to his quarters, weighed down by guilt and relief. Davos oversaw distribution of food to the starving populace, who had endured the siege and now faced shortages. In a secluded garden within the Red Keep's walls, Jon found Daenerys standing by an old fountain. A warm breeze drifted in from the sea, carrying faint hints of salt. Drogon perched high on a tower parapet, a silent sentinel. "You did what you had to do," Jon said softly as he approached. "The realm is free from the Lannister stranglehold." Daenerys nodded, gaze on the fountain's rippling surface. "But the realm will never forget the cruelty that led here. I must be better than those who came before me. It won't be easy." He stepped closer, voice low. "You won't be alone. Sansa and the North may keep their distance, but they'll honor a fair agreement. The other lords, given time, might learn to trust you." She turned, faint moonlight catching her hair. "And you, Jon? Or should I call you Aegon?" A flicker of pain crossed his face. "I'll always be Jon Snow. Let Aegon remain in the pages of history. The realm knows of my heritage, but I have no desire to press any claim. I want only to defend the people, help rebuild after all this death." She stepped closer, laying a hand on his chest. "Then stay with me. Help me rule, help me keep the peace. You're the only one I fully trust to speak truth, even when it pains me." His heart thudded in his chest. He thought of Winterfell, of Sansa's watchful eyes, of Arya's free spirit. He'd promised to protect the North, but perhaps protecting it meant ensuring a just ruler sat the throne. And Daenerys, for all her flaws and tragedies, had shown mercy to King's Landing, sparing thousands. "I'll stay," he said, voice soft, "at least for now, until the realm finds its footing." She let out a breath as though releasing a weight. Then, with a faint smile, she turned her gaze skyward, where Drogon's silhouette blotted out a corner of the moon. "We've come so far. If we can heal these wounds, maybe the kingdoms won't drown in blood again." Jon gently squeezed her hand. The war had ended, yet the real test was just beginning. He recalled the words Sam had read to him from an ancient text. The dragon has 3 heads. Rhaegar Targaryen had believed in prophecies, in a prince that was promised. But prophecies and legends mattered less now than the daily reality of ruling. If Daenerys and Jon could guide Westeros without plunging it back into chaos, that would be victory enough. Far below, the city lay in hush, broken by distant voices or the clink of armor. Men who had been enemies a fortnight past now worked side by side to clear rubble. Fires were being extinguished, and new torches lit on the walls. No longer a signal of war, but a promise of watchfulness. A battered capital, uncertain but alive. Tomorrow, Daenerys would enter the throne room in a formal procession, the lords in attendance, to be crowned properly on the Iron Throne. Tyrion would officiate some portion of the ceremony, Davos ensuring it ran smoothly. Envoys would be sent to every corner of the realm. The banners would be reshuffled. House Targaryen would once more reign, this time led by a queen who had crossed the narrow sea to break chains, and a man whose stark upbringing tempered the fires of old conquest. Standing together in that moonlit garden, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, did not know every obstacle to come, but they shared a moment of quiet hope, the ghost of a smile between them as they faced a future free from the dread of the dead, from the tyranny of Cersei, from the illusions of old prophecies. The land had survived the long night. Now dawn had come. They listened to the night's breeze stirring the garden leaves, heard Drogon's low rumble from the tower. For the first time in what felt like centuries, Westeros was poised on the edge of possibility. Though scars would remain, though hearts were still raw from war and heartbreak, there was a chance for something new. And so, in the hush of the Red Keep, the new Targaryen ruler and her faithful ally, raised a Stark but born of dragon's blood, steeled themselves for the reign ahead. The realm would not be healed in a day, but perhaps at last it had a ruler and a partner willing to try. Their story, an unwritten chapter of ice and fire, continued under the same sky that had once borne the shrieks of dragons and the crackle of war. Now those dragons might carry hope instead of destruction, if the fragile alliance of hearts and houses could endure in the face of all that would come next. For tonight, the city slept under the watchful gaze of one last living dragon. For tonight, the rightful queen stood triumphant yet humbled, side by side with the king who had saved the living from the dead. And for tonight, at least, no swords clashed, no bells tolled in warning. A fleeting peace settled across King's Landing, a peace paid for with countless lives. Whether it would last was a question that only tomorrow and the hearts of men could answer.